The first Psykers to walk among the legions Astartes were not called Librarians. They had no formal structure, no unified doctrine, and certainly no sanctioned place within the military hierarchies of the Great Crusade's early years. These warriors emerged sporadically across the legions, their abilities manifesting unpredictably during or after the transformation into Space Marines. Some legions regarded them with cautious interest, others with outright suspicion. The Emperor himself had yet to pronounce judgment on their existence, and in that silence, each legion master handled these psychically gifted warriors according to their own temperament and tactical philosophy. The Thousand Sons stood apart from the beginning. Magnus, the Red's legion, drew Psykers to its ranks like iron filings to a lodestone, and the Primarch made no attempt to hide or suppress their abilities. His warriors practiced their craft openly, weaving psychic power into their combat doctrine, with a sophistication that other legions found both impressive and unsettling. The Space Wolves, by contrast, maintained their rune priests, though Leman Russ insisted these warriors drew upon the spiritual essence of Fenris rather than the warp itself, a distinction most outside the 6th Legion found unconvincing. The Word-Bearers cultivated their own psychic specialists before the censure of Monarchia, while the White Scar Stormseers had practiced their craft since the Legion's reunification with Jagatai Khan. Other legions took a more measured approach. The Ultramarines identified Psykers within their ranks and segregated them into specialized units, applying Robute Guilliman's characteristic organizational logic to the problem. The Blood Angels acknowledged their psychic warriors but kept them dispersed throughout the Legion's structure. The Dark Angels maintained strict oversight of their Psykers, though what specific protocols the First Legion employed remained largely opaque to outsiders. The pattern repeated across the legions with variations, some acceptance here, some tolerance there, and in certain cases, active suppression. The biological mechanism underlying psychic manifestation in Space Marines remains imperfectly understood even by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The gene seed implantation process transforms a human into something transhuman, but it does not create psychic ability where none existed. Instead, the gene seed appears to interact with latent psychic potential already present in the aspirant's genetic structure. The process can amplify dormant abilities, bringing them to the surface during the brutal transformation or in the years immediately following. In some cases, the psychic awakening occurs during moments of extreme stress in battle, when the Space Marines' enhanced physiology and the pressure of combat create conditions for latent abilities to manifest violently. The selection of aspirants complicates this picture further. Most chapters recruit from feral or medieval worlds, where psychic mutations might go undetected until after implantation. The testing protocols designed to identify Psykers among normal human populations prove less reliable when applied to children who will undergo the Space Marine transformation. A youth who shows no psychic signature might develop abilities after receiving the catalepsian node or the sus and membrane. The interaction between the 19 gene seed organs and human genetics creates variables that even the most sophisticated augury cannot fully predict. Different gene seed lineages demonstrate varying rates of psychic manifestation. The Thousand Sons gene seed, even before the rubric of Ahriman, showed an unusually high correlation with psychic ability. Whether this reflected Magnus's own nature or deliberate engineering remains a matter of speculation. The Space Wolves gene seed similarly produces a notable percentage of Psykers, though the chapter's cultural framework insists on categorizing them differently. Other lineages show more modest rates. The Ultramarines produce Psykers at a frequency roughly consistent with the general human population, while the Imperial Fists demonstrate a slightly lower incidence. The distinction between a Librarian and other categories of Imperial Psykers extends far beyond mere terminology. A sanctioned Psyker serves as a tool of the Administratum or the Inquisition, their training focused on specific utilitarian applications of their gift. They learn to divine information, to communicate across distances, to detect corruption or falsehood. Their combat capabilities, when they possess any, remain secondary to these primary functions. An astropath undergoes the soul-binding ritual on Terra, sacrificing their sight and binding their essence to the Emperor's, will in exchange for the ability to project their thoughts across the galaxy's vast distances. Navigators represent something else entirely, a stable psychic mutation cultivated across millennia, their third eye allowing them to perceive the warp's currents and guide void ships through the Immaterium. A librarian combines the physical supremacy of a space marine with psychic power trained for war. Where a sanctioned psyker might struggle to lift a las rifle with telekinesis, a librarian can crush a tank's hull or deflect incoming fire from an entire squad. The psychic disciplines available to librarians focus overwhelmingly on battlefield applications: biomancy to enhance already formidable physical capabilities, pyromancy to immolate the Emperor's enemies, telekinesis to manipulate the combat environment, divination to predict enemy movements and counter ambushes. Their training emphasizes integration with squad-level tactics, supporting battle brothers while eliminating threats that conventional weapons cannot address. The power differential matters significantly. A typical sanctioned psyker might rate as a delta or gamma level psyker in the Imperial classification system. Librarians routinely demonstrate beta level abilities, with some reaching the alpha level threshold that marks truly dangerous psychic potential. This raw power, combined with a Space Marine's enhanced physiology and centuries of combat experience, makes a librarian one of the Imperium's most formidable assets. A chief librarian of a first founding chapter commands psychic might that rivals many inquisitors, though the comparison remains imperfect given the different focuses of their training. The conditioning process that transforms a psyker space marine into a librarian begins after the standard Astartes indoctrination completes. The chapter's librarius identifies the aspirant, either through testing or because the psychic abilities have already manifested. What follows differs substantially from the hypno-conditioning and physical trials that create a standard battle brother. The psychic training emphasizes mental architecture, constructing barriers within the mind to compartmentalize psychic power and prevent the warp from bleeding through uncontrolled. The aspirant learns the fundamental disciplines, starting with simple exercises in psychic perception and progressing to active manipulation of warp energy. This training carries profound risks. The warp does not distinguish between a space marine and a normal human when it comes to possession or corruption. A librarian in training must learn to touch the Immaterium while maintaining absolute control, to channel its power without allowing it to channel back through him. The process claims casualties. Some aspirants lose themselves to the warp during training, their minds shattered by forces they cannot contain. Others fall to possession, requiring immediate execution before the demon can fully manifest. The librarius maintains constant vigilance over trainees, ready to intervene at the first sign of corruption. Unlike astropaths, librarians do not undergo soul binding. This crucial distinction often gets overlooked by those unfamiliar with the Imperium's psychic infrastructure. The soul binding ritual performed in the Emperor's presence on Terra serves a specific purpose. It anchors an astropath's psychic signature to the Emperor's own essence, allowing them to project their consciousness across interstellar distances while maintaining a connection to the Astronomicon. The ritual burns out the astropath's physical sight and leaves them forever changed, but it provides protection against certain forms of warp predation. Librarians require no such binding. Their role demands flexibility and combat capability that the soul binding process would compromise. Instead, they rely on training, mental discipline, and the psychic wards and protections taught by the librarius. The psychic hood serves as the most visible symbol of a librarian's specialized training. This psychic amplifier and protection device connects directly to the librarian's neural interface, enhancing their ability to project and control warp energy while providing some defense against hostile psychic attack. The hood's design varies by chapter, reflecting local traditions and available technology, but the underlying principles remain consistent. Some chapters incorporate additional psychic focusing tools, rune stones, tarot cards, psychically attuned crystals, though these accessories supplement rather than replace the fundamental mental disciplines. The librarius of each chapter maintains its own training protocols, often jealously guarded from outsiders. The specific techniques for resisting demonic incursion, the meditative practices for maintaining mental equilibrium, the methods for safely pushing psychic abilities to their limits. All of these vary between chapters. The Blood Angels teach their librarians to channel and control the red thirst, using their psychic abilities to suppress the genetic flaw that haunts their chapter. The Dark Angels librarians learn secrets of psychic interrogation and mental invasion, tools suited to their chapter's obsessive hunt for the fallen. The Space Wolves rune priests incorporate shamanistic practices from Fenrisian tradition, though the underlying psychic principles remain the same regardless of cultural framework. The Council of Nikaea represented the Emperor's direct intervention into a debate that had festered within the Legion's Astartes for decades. By the early years of the 31st millennium, the question of psychic warriors within the legions had evolved from a matter of individual legion policy into a crisis threatening the unity of the Great Crusade itself. Reports of psychic incidents, some catastrophic, others merely disturbing, accumulated in the archives of the Divisio Militaris. Entire companies had witnessed their librarians torn apart by entities from the warp. Mortal army regiments serving alongside psychically active legions filed complaints about unnatural phenomena and unexplained casualties. The whispers grew too loud for even the Emperor to ignore. The Emperor convened the council in approximately the year, one of the 31st millennium on Nikaea, a world brought into compliance generations earlier and selected specifically for its distance from the major war zones of the Great Crusade. The choice of venue carried significance. This would be no hasty battlefield conference, but a formal deliberation requiring the presence of the Primarchs themselves. The summons went out across the galaxy, pulling the Emperor's sons from their campaigns and bringing them together for only the second time since the triumph of Ulanor. Not all the Primarchs attended, but enough answered the call to ensure that every perspective on the Psyker question would receive consideration. Magnus the Red arrived on Nikaea with a delegation of his most accomplished librarians, warriors whose mastery of the psychic disciplines represented the pinnacle of what the Thousand Sons had achieved. The Crimson King intended to demonstrate that psychic power, properly trained and rigorously controlled, posed no threat to the Imperium. His preparations for the council had consumed months of effort, compiling evidence and preparing arguments that would prove the necessity of librarians to the Great Crusade's continued success. Magnus believed absolutely in the rightness of his position. The warp represented a tool like any other, dangerous only when wielded by the ignorant or the careless. His legion had suffered losses to psychic mishaps, certainly, but they had also achieved victories that would have been impossible without their abilities. Mortarion came to Nikaea with a different conviction entirely. The Primarch of the Death Guard had witnessed the horrors of uncontrolled psychic power on Barbaros, where Psyker overlords had ruled through terror and sorcery. His hatred for witchcraft ran deeper than tactical concerns or philosophical abstractions. It emerged from lived experience of psychic tyranny. Mortarion viewed every Psyker as a potential vector for the same corruption that had plagued his adoptive homeworld. The distinction between a trained librarian and a feral witch king mattered little to him. Both drew power from the same source, and that source could not be trusted regardless of the user's intentions or training. Leman Russ attended the council with his rune priests, though the Wolf King maintained his legion's traditional position that these warriors practiced something fundamentally different from the sorcery of the Thousand Sons. The Space Wolves' psychic traditions drew upon Fenrisian shamanism, channeling what Russ characterized as the spiritual essence of his homeworld rather than the raw stuff of the warp. Whether this distinction held any meaningful difference remained a point of fierce contention. To Magnus, the rune priests represented the worst sort of hypocrisy, Psykers who refused to acknowledge their own nature. To Russ, the difference was self-evident and required no elaborate justification. His warriors served the Allfather's will without delving into forbidden knowledge or trafficking with entities from beyond reality. Jagatai Khan brought the perspective of Chogoris to the debate, though the Khan's position defied easy categorization. The White Scars Stormseers had practiced their craft since the Legion's reunification with their Primarch, and Khan saw no reason to abandon traditions that had served his warriors well. He recognized the dangers inherent in psychic power, but considered those dangers manageable through proper discipline and cultural framework. The Khan had little patience for Mortarion's absolutism or Magnus's elaborate theoretical justifications. Power existed to be used, and warriors who feared their own weapons had already lost the battle. Sanguinius attended as well, though the angel's position remained characteristically measured. The Blood Angels employed librarians, and had done so throughout the Great Crusade, but Sanguinius understood the concerns raised by the anti-Psyker faction. His own visions of the future had shown him horrors that might yet come to pass, and he knew that psychic power could serve as a gateway for forces hostile to humanity. Yet he also recognized that the Imperium had already committed itself to utilizing Psykers across its vast bureaucratic and military apparatus. To ban librarians while maintaining astropaths and sanction Psykers seemed inconsistent at best. Malcador, the sigillite, observed the proceedings with the authority of the Emperor's closest advisor. The ancient Psyker had overseen the development of the Imperium's psychic infrastructure, establishing the protocols for soul binding and the training regimens for sanctioned Psykers. His understanding of the warp exceeded that of any present save perhaps Magnus himself, and his silence during much of the debate carried its own weight. When Malcador spoke, his words shaped the Emperor's understanding of the issues at stake. Other Primarchs contributed their perspectives as well. Lorgar Aurelian, still smarting from the humiliation at Monarchia, spoke against the unrestricted use of psychic power, though his arguments carried less weight given his recent censure. Fulgrim attended but showed little interest in the technical debates, considering the entire matter a distraction from more pressing concerns. Rogel Dorn maintained his characteristic pragmatism, focusing on the practical implications of any decision rather than philosophical abstractions. The Iron Hand's Ferrus Manus expressed skepticism about abilities that could not be quantified or reliably reproduced, though he acknowledged their tactical utility in specific circumstances. The arguments presented by both factions revealed fundamentally incompatible worldviews. Magnus and his supporters emphasized the necessity of psychic power in combating threats that conventional weapons could not address. Demons, hostile Psykers, and Xeno's witches required psychic countermeasures. The Librarius provided those countermeasures in a controlled, militarily integrated format. Magnus presented evidence of victories achieved through psychic intervention, battles turned by timely divination, enemy leaders assassinated through psychic assault, defensive positions held against impossible odds through biomantic enhancement of Space Marine physiology. He demonstrated psychic techniques before the assembled Primarchs, showing the precision and control that proper training could achieve. The Crimson King also addressed the theoretical framework underlying safe psychic practice. He spoke of the enumerations, the mental exercises developed by the Thousand Suns to compartmentalize and control psychic power. He explained the classification systems his legion used to identify and manage different levels of psychic ability, ensuring that no warrior attempted feats beyond their capacity. Magnus argued that the solution to psychic incidents was not prohibition but better training, more rigorous oversight, and continued research into the nature of the warp itself. Knowledge represented humanity's greatest weapon, and willful ignorance in the face of psychic threats amounted to strategic suicide. Mortarian countered with accounts of psychic catastrophes. He described incidents where librarians had lost control during battle, their bodies serving as gateways for entities that slaughtered their own battle brothers. He presented testimony from Legion commanders who had witnessed their Psykers consumed by the very powers they claimed to control. The Death Lord argued that no amount of training could eliminate the fundamental danger inherent in touching the warp. Every psychic act created a vulnerability, a momentary opening through which hostile forces might pour. The risk-benefit calculation could never favor continued use of Psykers when conventional weapons and tactics could achieve the same objectives without inviting demonic incursion. Russ supported Mortarian's position while carving out an exception for his rune priests, a stance that Magnus found infuriating. The Wolf King described the Thousand Suns as arrogant sorcerers delving into forbidden knowledge, their elaborate theories merely justifications for dangerous practices. He recounted instances where he had witnessed Magnus's warriors engaging in rituals that bore uncomfortable similarities to the practices of enemies humanity had fought during Old Night. The fact that these rituals served imperial objectives did not, in Russ's view, make them any less corrupting. The Khan offered a middle path, suggesting that psychic power required cultural context and spiritual discipline rather than purely intellectual understanding. The Stormseers of Chogoris practiced their craft within a framework of tribal tradition and warrior philosophy that kept them grounded. Khan argued that the problem with the Thousand Sons was not their psychic abilities, but their approach: too much theory, too much experimentation, insufficient respect for the dangers they courted. He proposed that each legion maintain its own psychic traditions under the oversight of their primarchs, who best understood their warriors' needs and capabilities. The debate extended across multiple sessions, with each faction presenting witnesses and evidence. Librarians from various legions testified about their training and their experiences in combat. Legion commanders spoke to the tactical value of psychic support or the disruption caused by psychic incidents. Representatives from the Imperial Army described encounters with Legion Psykers, their accounts ranging from grateful acknowledgement of psychic assistance to horror at witnessing phenomena they could not comprehend. The sheer volume of testimony threatened to overwhelm any possibility of clear resolution. The Emperor's judgment, when it finally came, satisfied no one completely. The Edict of Nikaea banned the use of psychic powers within the Legion's Astartes and ordered the immediate disbandment of all Librarius departments. The Emperor declared that while humanity would continue to rely on astropaths and sanctioned psychers for essential functions, the legions would no longer maintain psychic warriors within their ranks. Existing librarians were to return to standard combat roles, forbidden from utilizing their abilities regardless of circumstance. The edict made no distinction between the elaborate psychic disciplines of the Thousand Sons and the shamanistic practices of the Space Wolves rune priests. All were equally prohibited. The reasoning behind the Emperor's decision remained opaque. He offered no detailed explanation, no philosophical justification for choosing prohibition over regulation. Some interpreted the edict as a political compromise, an attempt to maintain unity among the Primarchs by satisfying the anti-Psyker faction's demands. Others believed the Emperor had foreseen dangers that even Magnus did not comprehend, threats that required the complete suppression of Legion's psychic capabilities. The most cynical observers suggested that the Emperor simply tired of the debate and imposed a solution that would end the controversy regardless of its practical implications. Magnus departed Nikaea in a state of barely contained fury. The Crimson King had invested everything in convincing the Emperor of the rightness of his position, and the rejection cut deeper than any battlefield wound. He returned to Prospero, convinced that the edict represented a catastrophic mistake, a surrender to ignorance and superstition that would cost the Imperium dearly in battles yet to come. The Thousand Sons began the process of disbanding their Librarius, but the compliance remained grudging and incomplete. How could warriors who had spent decades mastering psychic disciplines simply abandon their abilities because of a decree from Terra? The enforcement of the edict varied dramatically across the legions. The Death Guard and the Space Wolves, having championed the anti-Psyker position, moved swiftly to comply, though Russ maintained his rune priests under the fiction that they practiced something other than sorcery. The Ultramarines implemented the edict with characteristic efficiency, reassigning their librarians to standard combat positions and sealing the psychic training facilities. The Dark Angels complied publicly while maintaining their own secrets, as was their way. The Blood Angels reluctantly disbanded their Librarius, though Sanguinius privately doubted the wisdom of the decision. Other legions proved less cooperative. The White Scars continued to employ their Stormseers in all but name, maintaining the cultural traditions that Khan considered inseparable from his legion's identity. The Thousand Sons' compliance remained superficial at best, with Magnus's warriors continuing to practice their disciplines in private. The Word-Bearers, already embarked on their secret path toward damnation, viewed the edict as yet another example of the Emperor's hypocrisy and blindness. The fate of individual librarians depended largely on their Primarch's attitude and their legion's culture. Some adapted to their new roles without complaint, channeling their energies into conventional combat and command responsibilities. Others chafed under the restriction, feeling crippled by the prohibition against using abilities that had become integral to their identity as warriors. A few went rogue, abandoning their legions rather than submit to the edict's constraints. These renegades would later prove valuable recruits for the forces of chaos, their bitterness making them susceptible to corruption. The Edict of Nikaea created fault lines that would widen catastrophically in the years to come. Magnus's resentment festered, contributing to the decisions that would lead to the burning of Prospero. The Thousand Sons' continued psychic practices, conducted in defiance of the edict, provided ammunition for those who already distrusted the 15th Legion. When Magnus attempted to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal through psychic means, he violated the edict in the most spectacular fashion possible, shattering the psychic wards protecting the Imperial Webway project and unleashing horrors upon Terra itself. The Warmaster's betrayal at Istvan III rendered the Edict of Nikaea effectively void within hours of the first virus bombs falling. The theoretical debates conducted in the halls of Nikaea had presumed a unified Imperium, where compliance with the Emperor's decrees remained possible and enforceable. That presumption died with the Loyalists trapped in the Coral City. The legions found themselves fighting not theoretical enemies, but their own brothers, and the luxury of restricting available weapons vanished in the face of immediate survival. The Librarians who had reluctantly set aside their powers after Nikaea now faced a choice between maintaining their compliance with the edict or utilizing every capability at their disposal to combat traitors who acknowledged no such restrictions. The warnings that Librarians attempted to provide before the heresy erupted went largely unheeded, a failure that would haunt the Imperium for millennia. Magnus the Red's catastrophic attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's corruption through psychic means had already violated the edict in the most destructive manner possible, shattering the psychic wards protecting the Imperial Webway project beneath the Imperial Palace. The Emperor's furious response, dispatching Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to Prospero with orders to bring Magnus to account, demonstrated how thoroughly the Edict of Nikaea had poisoned the well of psychic intelligence gathering. When Magnus most needed to be believed, his method of communication guaranteed his message would be rejected as the ravings of a sorcerer who had finally succumbed to the very corruption Mortarion had warned against. Other Librarians experienced premonitions and psychic disturbances in the months preceding Istvan III, but the edict created an environment where such warnings could not be effectively communicated. A Blood Angels librarian who experienced visions of battle brothers turning on each other found himself unable to report these impressions through proper channels without admitting to continued psychic practice in violation of the edict. A Dark Angels Psyker who sensed a growing corruption spreading through the 16th Legion kept his concerns private, knowing that revealing his source of information would result in censure or worse. The edict had not merely banned the use of psychic powers, it had created a culture of silence around psychic phenomena that prevented the very intelligence gathering that might have exposed the conspiracy earlier. The burning of Prospero represented the first major engagement of the heresy, where Librarians played a decisive role, though not in any way the architects of the edict could have anticipated. The Space Wolves arrived in the Prospero system with explicit orders to bring Magnus and his legion to account for violating the edict. Accompanying Russ were elements of the Adeptus Astartes and Sisters of Silence, the latter specifically deployed to nullify the psychic advantages the Thousand Sons had historically relied upon. The attack caught the 15th Legion unprepared not because they lacked warning. Magnus had foreseen the assault through his own prescient abilities, but because the Crimson King had forbidden his sons from mounting any defense, accepting the Emperor's punishment as deserved. That acceptance lasted only until the Space Wolves began their orbital bombardment of Tizca, the City of Light. As the capital of Prospero burned, and the Thousand Sons watched their life's work reduced to ash, the Legion's Librarians, who had never truly abandoned their psychic disciplines despite the edict, prepared for battle. The defense of Prospero showcased psychic warfare at a scale rarely witnessed before or since. Thousand Sons Librarians erected kind shields that deflected incoming fire, turned the Space Wolves' own ammunition against them through telekinetic redirection, and struck down entire packs of Grey Hunters with focused pyromantic assaults. The Prosperine Spire Guard, enhanced and directed by psychic coordination, fought with a cohesion that should have been impossible given the chaos of the assault. The Sisters of Silence proved devastatingly effective against individual Thousand Suns, their pariah nature creating zones of psychic nullification that left Magnus's warriors vulnerable. Yet even the anathema Psychona could not be everywhere at once, and the Thousand Suns librarians adapted their tactics to avoid direct confrontation with the Silent Sisterhood. They coordinated through psychic communion, sharing tactical information instantaneously across the entire battlefield. They identified priority targets through precognitive flashes and directed fire with supernatural accuracy. When the Space Wolves' rune priests attempted to counter these efforts, despite Russ's insistence that his warriors practiced something fundamentally different from sorcery, the psychic duel that erupted above Tizca created phenomena visible from orbit. The Battle of Prospero ended in tactical victory for the Space Wolves, but strategic catastrophe for the Imperium. Magnus, driven to desperation by the destruction of everything he had built, finally accepted the bargain offered by Tzeentch. The Thousand Suns who survived the assault found themselves transported to the planet of the sorcerers within the Eye of Terror, their legion irrevocably committed to the traitor cause. The librarians of the 15th Legion had defended their homeworld with every psychic technique they possessed, only to discover that their salvation came at the price of their souls. The corruption that Mortarion had warned against at Nikaea had finally manifested, though not because the Thousand Suns lacked discipline or training. The trap had been set long before, and the edict itself had served as bait. News of Prospero's fate reached the Loyalist legions piecemeal and distorted, arriving in fragments carried by refugee ships and garbled astropathic transmissions. The initial reports suggested that Magnus had fallen to corruption exactly as the anti-Psyker faction at Nikaea had predicted, vindicating the edict's restrictions. Only later did the full complexity of the situation become apparent, that Russ had been manipulated into attacking a legion that might have remained loyal, that Magnus's violation of the edict had been motivated by desperate loyalty rather than corruption, that the entire affair had served the ruinous powers' agenda perfectly. By then, the heresy had spread across the galaxy, and there was no time for recriminations or second-guessing. The gradual unofficial reinstatement of librarians among the Loyalist forces began not through any formal decree, but through immediate tactical necessity. At Calth, when the word-bearers launched their surprise assault on the Ultramarines, the 13th Legion's banned librarians emerged from their enforced retirement to combat the sorcerous powers the traitors wielded openly. The word-bearers had embraced chaos worship fully by this point, their own former librarians transformed into sorcerers channeling demonic power without restraint or caution. The Ultramarines discovered that conventional weapons and tactics proved insufficient against enemies who could summon entities from the warp or strike with psychic lightning. Their librarians, still trained and disciplined despite years of enforced inactivity, provided the only effective countermeasure. Robute Gilliman made the practical calculation that the Edict of Nikaea had been rendered irrelevant by the scale of the betrayal. His legion faced enemies who acknowledged no restrictions on their use of sorcery, and maintaining compliance with the edict, while his warriors died to psychic assault, struck the Lord of Ultramar as absurd. He quietly authorized his librarians to resume their duties, framing the decision as a temporary battlefield expedient necessitated by emergency circumstances. Other Primarchs reached similar conclusions through their own reasoning. Sanguinius had never believed the edict was wise policy, and the desperate battles the Blood Angels fought during the heresy convinced him that every weapon must be employed. Rogel Dorn, fortifying Terra against the inevitable assault, concluded that defending the Imperial Palace required the use of psychic warriors regardless of what had been decreed at Nikaea. The process remained unofficial and uncoordinated, with each loyalist force making its own determination about whether and how to employ librarians. Some commanders reinstated their psychers fully, others allowed limited use of psychic abilities in specific circumstances, and a few maintained strict compliance with the edict even as their forces suffered accordingly. The lack of unified policy created confusion and inconsistency, but the alternative, attempting to convene another council to formally revoke the edict while the Imperium burned, was obviously impossible. The librarians themselves adapted to this ambiguous status, understanding that their rehabilitation remained contingent on immediate utility rather than any principled reversal of the Emperor's judgment. The psychic defense during the Siege of Terra demonstrated the indispensable role that librarians played in the Imperium's survival. The traitor forces that finally reached the Sol system after 7 years of civil war brought with them powers that conventional military force could not adequately address. The Word-Bearers and Thousand Sons had fully embraced their transformation into sorcerers, wielding chaos-fueled abilities that dwarfed what any loyalist librarian could safely channel. The World Eaters, consumed by the Blood God's rage, generated psychic pressure through sheer bloodlust that threatened to overwhelm defenders' mental defenses. The Emperor's children had descended into such depravity that their mere presence created localized warp disturbances. Against these threats, the Imperial Fists, Blood Angels, and White Scars defending Terra required psychic support. The librarians assigned to the palace's defense worked in coordinated groups, establishing psychic wards across critical locations and maintaining constant vigilance against demonic incursion. When the traitors breached the ultimate gate, it was a cadre of Imperial Fists librarians who held the psychic breach long enough for reinforcements to arrive and seal the physical gap. Blood Angels Psykers worked to suppress the Black Rage that threatened to consume their battle brothers during the most desperate phases of the siege, channeling their abilities inward to maintain their legion's cohesion. White Scars Stormseers provided early warning of enemy movements through psychic reconnaissance, their abilities proving more reliable than conventional augury in the warp-saturated environment surrounding Terra. The deployment of librarians in covert operations behind traitor lines represented another critical application of psychic abilities during the heresy. The Alpha Legion's betrayal had demonstrated that the traitors possessed sophisticated intelligence networks and operational security that conventional infiltration struggled to penetrate. Librarians offered capabilities that no amount of training or equipment could replicate in non-psykers. A Raven Guard librarian could use psychic camouflage to move through enemy territory completely undetected, his abilities complementing his legion's natural aptitude for stealth warfare. Dark Angel Psykers employed mental manipulation to extract information from captured traitors or to implant false intelligence in enemy agents before releasing them. These covert operations achieved results that justified the risks involved. A team of Space Wolves operating behind Word-Bearers' lines successfully identified and eliminated a sorcerer cabal that had been coordinating demonic summoning rituals across an entire sector. Salamander's librarians infiltrated a Death Guard logistics hub and used their abilities to sabotage the traitors' supply network in ways that appeared to be natural equipment failures rather than enemy action. The psychological impact of these operations extended beyond their immediate tactical effects. The traitors could never be certain whether their security had been compromised, whether their communications remained private, or whether the warriors standing beside them had been psychically influenced. The corruption of traitor librarians into full sorcerers represented the ultimate vindication of the concerns raised at Nikaea, though not in the manner Mortarion or Russ had articulated. The Death Lord had argued that any use of psychic power created vulnerability to corruption, that no amount of training or discipline could eliminate the fundamental danger. Events proved him both right and wrong. The traitor librarians did indeed fall to corruption, but not because they lacked discipline or training. The Thousand Sons remained the most rigorously trained psykers in the galaxy, even as they damned themselves. The corruption came through deliberate choice, through the decision to embrace chaos in exchange for power that no loyal psyker could safely wield. The transformation process varied by legion and patron deity. The Thousand Sons who survived Prospero found themselves in the service of Tzeentch, the architect of fate. Their sorcery grew exponentially more powerful as they abandoned the enumerations and other safety protocols that had previously constrained them. They learned to summon demons, to reshape reality through ritual, to perceive futures and pasts with clarity that Magnus himself had rarely achieved. The price came due when Ahriman, attempting to halt the flesh change that plagued his legion, cast the rubric that reduced most thousand suns to animated dust within their armor. The sorcerers who retained their consciousness and bodies became something no longer entirely human, their souls bound to the changer of ways in ways that made their earlier psychic practices seem innocent by comparison. The word-bearers' transformation followed a different path, their sorcerers serving chaos undivided rather than any single deity. They learned to channel the power of all four ruinous powers, becoming conduits for demonic entities that used them as anchors in reality. Their rituals grew elaborate and horrific, requiring sacrifices and components that would have been unthinkable to any loyal librarian. They summoned greater demons to the battlefield, opened warp rifts that swallowed entire armies, and corrupted the very ground they walked upon. The Dark Apostles who led the Word-Bearers combined religious fervor with sorcerous might, preaching the divinity of chaos while demonstrating its power through acts that defied natural law. The World Eaters produced fewer sorcerers than other traitor legions, as Khorne's hatred of psychic power created tension with those who had once served as librarians. Some World Eaters' Psykers found their abilities withering as they embraced the blood god's worship, their connection to the warp redirected into pure physical rage. Others managed to maintain their psychic capabilities by framing them as extensions of Khorne's fury rather than traditional sorcery, though the distinction remained theologically dubious. These warrior sorcerers channeled their powers exclusively toward enhancing combat capabilities and breaking enemy morale, eschewing the elaborate rituals favored by the Word-Bearers or Thousand Sons. The Emperor's children, who had served as librarians before the heresy, became sorcerers of Slaanesh, their abilities warped by the Prince of Pleasure into tools of corruption and excess. They learned to project psychic stimuli that overwhelmed victim senses, to manipulate emotions with surgical precision, and to reshape flesh through biomantic techniques that no loyalist would dare attempt. Their sorcery focused on sensation and experience rather than raw destructive power, though the results proved no less devastating to their enemies. A Slaaneshi sorcerer could reduce an entire company to catatonic husks through psychic assault, or drive them to such heights of sensation that their hearts simply stopped. The Night Lords and Iron Warriors maintained smaller contingents of sorcerers, viewing psychic power primarily as another tool in their arsenals rather than a path to enlightenment or transcendence. Night Lord sorcerers specialized in fear and psychological warfare, using their abilities to amplify the terror tactics their legion had always favored. Iron Warriors who embraced sorcery did so with characteristic pragmatism, treating demonic summoning and warp manipulation as engineering problems to be solved through systematic application of principles. Their approach lacked the religious fervor of the Word-Bearers or the scholarly obsession of the Thousand Sons, but proved no less effective for its cold practicality. The formal structure that emerged from the heresy's ashes represented a complete reversal of the Edict of Nikaea, though the Imperium never officially acknowledged this fact through any grand pronouncement or decree. The Librarius as it exists in the 41st millennium developed organically during the Scouring and the subsequent millennia, each chapter adapting the basic framework to their particular needs and traditions. The Codex Astartes provided the template that most chapters followed, though Robute Guilliman's great work addressed the organization of librarians with somewhat less specificity than other aspects of chapter structure. This relative flexibility allowed for significant variation between chapters while maintaining enough commonality that a librarian from one chapter could generally understand the rank structure and responsibilities of his counterparts in another. The Lexicanium represents the entry rank for a Space Marine who has completed his basic psychic training and been deemed ready for combat deployment as a librarian. These junior Psykers have mastered the fundamental disciplines, typically one or two psychic specializations that they can employ reliably under battlefield conditions. A Lexicanium might demonstrate competence in biomancy sufficient to enhance his own physical capabilities or heal moderate wounds in his battle brothers, but he would not yet possess the skill to resurrect a warrior from the brink of death or reshape another's physiology in the midst of combat. The rank designation itself derives from the ancient Terran term for a student or apprentice, reflecting the Lexicanium's status as a warrior still learning his craft despite having already undergone decades of training. Lexicaniums typically deploy attached to individual companies rather than operating independently or in specialized librarius formations. A battle company might include 1 or 2 Lexicaniums who serve under the company captain's direct command while continuing their psychic education under the supervision of more senior librarians. This arrangement serves multiple purposes. It provides the company with psychic support for combat operations, gives the Lexicanium practical experience applying his abilities in real battlefield conditions, and allows senior librarians to observe the junior Psykers' performance and identify areas requiring additional training. The Lexicanium learns to coordinate with tactical squads, to time his psychic interventions for maximum effect, and to manage his abilities across extended campaigns where exhaustion and warp exposure accumulate dangerously. The progression from Lexicanium to Codicere marks the point where a librarian achieves full battle brother status within the Librarius. A Codicere has mastered multiple psychic disciplines and demonstrated the judgment necessary to employ them without constant supervision. The rank name references the ancient codices in which the Librarius records its accumulated knowledge, suggesting that a Codicere has internalized enough of that knowledge to be considered a reliable keeper of the chapter's psychic traditions. The promotion typically occurs after several decades of service as a Lexicanium, though exceptional circumstances can accelerate the timeline. A Lexicanium who demonstrates extraordinary capability during a critical battle might find himself elevated ahead of schedule. Codicers represent the working core of most chapters' Librarius departments. They possess sufficient power and skill to handle the majority of psychic threats a chapter encounters, while remaining numerous enough to be deployed across multiple companies simultaneously. A typical Codex-compliant chapter maintains perhaps a dozen Codicers among its Librarius, though this number varies based on the chapter's recruitment success and the rate at which psychic abilities manifest among aspirants. These battle brother librarians take on responsibilities beyond simple combat deployment. They begin training Lexicaniums, contribute to the Librarius's research into psychic phenomena, and participate in the investigation of potential threats to the chapter. The Codicere rank also marks the point where specialization becomes more pronounced. A librarian might focus his development on a particular psychic discipline, becoming known within the chapter as an expert biomancer or diviner. Others develop expertise in specific types of threats. One Codicere might specialize in combating demonic incursions, while another focuses on countering enemy Psykers. This specialization allows the Librarius to deploy the right capabilities against specific threats, rather than treating all librarians as interchangeable assets. When the chapter faces a genestealer cult with psychically active patriarchs, the chief librarian can dispatch Codicers whose training and experience specifically address that type of enemy. The epistolary rank represents veteran status within the Librarius, comparable to a first company veteran among standard battle brothers. An epistolary has survived centuries of psychic combat, mastered 3 or more disciplines to a high degree, and demonstrated both power and control sufficient to handle the most dangerous psychic threats. The rank name derives from ancient Terran traditions of letter writing and record keeping, reflecting the epistolary's role in documenting the Librarius's accumulated knowledge and adding to it through his own research and experience. An epistolary typically commands respect not just for his psychic might, but for his understanding of the warp's nature and the threats that emerge from it. Epistolaries often operate with significant independence, leading missions that require specialized psychic capabilities or serving as advisors to senior chapter command. A chapter master planning a campaign against a chaos cult might assign an epistolary to his command staff specifically to provide expertise on the enemy's likely sorceress capabilities. A company captain facing unexplained phenomena on a compliance world might request an epistolary's assistance in investigating whether the disturbances represent psychic activity, Xeno's influence, or natural causes that simply appear supernatural. The epistolary brings not just raw power, but centuries of accumulated knowledge about how psychic threats manifest and how they can be countered. The training responsibilities of epistolaries extend beyond the direct instruction of junior librarians. They develop new techniques for the chapter's librarius, experiment with psychic applications that might prove tactically useful, and maintain the chapter's defenses against psychic attack. An epistolary might spend months researching a particular demon type that the chapter encountered, compiling information about its capabilities and weaknesses, so that future encounters can be handled more effectively. Another might work with the chapter's tech marines to develop improved psychic hoods or other equipment that enhances librarian capabilities. The epistolary serves as both warrior and scholar, combining practical combat experience with theoretical understanding. The chief librarian stands at the apex of the chapter's psychic hierarchy, a position of authority comparable to the Master of Sanctity or Master of the Forge. The chief librarian commands all psychic resources within the chapter, oversees the training of every librarian from lexicanium to epistolary, and serves as the primary advisor to the chapter master on all matters involving the warp or psychic phenomena. The selection of a chief librarian involves both psychic capability and leadership qualities. The most powerful psyker in the chapter does not automatically assume the position if he lacks the judgment and command skills necessary to manage the librarius effectively. The chief librarian's responsibilities as keeper of the chapter's history extend far beyond simple record keeping. The librarius maintains the chapter's archives, preserving not just battle records and honor rolls, but the accumulated knowledge that defines the chapter's identity and traditions. The chief librarian oversees this archive personally, determining what information requires preservation, how it should be organized, and who may access particularly sensitive records. In chapters with troubled histories or dark secrets, the chief librarian often serves as one of the few warriors entrusted with complete knowledge of events the chapter prefers to keep hidden. The Dark Angel's chief librarians, for instance, maintain extensive records of the fallen and the chapter's ongoing hunt for these traitors, information compartmentalized away from battle brothers who have not been inducted into the inner circle. The advisory role that chief librarians play in chapter command structures varies significantly based on the chapter master's personality and the chapter's culture. Some chapter masters rely heavily on their chief librarian's counsel, consulting him before major decisions and incorporating psychic intelligence into strategic planning. Others maintain a more distant relationship, calling upon the chief librarian only when psychic threats specifically require his expertise. The relationship between Azrael and Ezekiel in the Dark Angels demonstrates the former pattern. The Supreme Grand Master and the Grand Master of Librarians work in close coordination, with Ezekiel providing not just psychic support but strategic counsel informed by his understanding of the chapter's history and the nature of their enemies. The Chief Librarian's command of psychic resources includes not just the librarians themselves, but the various tools and facilities the chapter maintains for psychic training and research. The librarius typically occupies a dedicated section of the chapter's fortress monastery, including training chambers warded against psychic mishaps, meditation cells where librarians can safely push their abilities to their limits, and archives containing the accumulated psychic knowledge of generations. The chief librarian determines how these resources are allocated, which research projects receive priority, and what new capabilities the librarius should develop. When a chapter faces a new type of psychic threat, the chief librarian mobilizes the librarius's resources to understand and counter it. The specialized roles within larger librarius organizations reflect both practical necessity and chapter-specific traditions. Archivists represent a formal specialization found in many chapters, librarians who focus primarily on the preservation and organization of knowledge rather than combat deployment. An archivist might spend decades cataloging ancient texts recovered from space hulks, cross-referencing historical accounts to establish accurate timelines of the chapter's campaigns, or maintaining the psychic wards that protect particularly dangerous tomes from corruption. The role requires psychic ability primarily for defensive purposes, detecting chaos taint in recovered documents, reinforcing protective barriers around forbidden knowledge, and identifying when seemingly innocent texts contain hidden dangers. The Blood Angels maintain specialized positions within their Librarius that address the chapter's unique genetic curse. Certain librarians focus specifically on managing the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, developing techniques to suppress these afflictions in their battle brothers, or to channel them in controlled ways that enhance combat effectiveness without leading to complete loss of control. These specialists work closely with the sanguinary priests, combining psychic intervention with the apothecarian's biological treatments to manage conditions that would cripple a chapter lacking such specialized support. When a Blood Angel begins showing signs of succumbing to the Black Rage, a librarian trained in these techniques might be able to delay or even temporarily reverse the process, buying time for the warrior to be properly inducted into the Death Company rather than falling to madness in the midst of battle. The Death Company itself requires psychic oversight that represents one of the Blood Angels' Librarius's most challenging responsibilities. The chaplains who shepherd the Death Company provide spiritual guidance and tactical direction, but librarians must monitor the psychic phenomena that accompany the Black Rage. The visions that consume Death Company warriors generate psychic pressure that can affect nearby battle brothers, potentially triggering the rage in others who might otherwise resist it. Librarians assigned to Death Company operations work to contain this psychic bleed-off, preventing the madness from spreading while allowing the afflicted warriors to fight with the terrible fury that makes them so devastating in assault operations. The Space Wolves reject the standard Librarius terminology entirely, maintaining their rune priests as a distinct organization that predates the Imperium itself. The rune priests insist they draw upon Fenris's spiritual essence rather than the warp, a distinction that most outside the chapter consider semantic rather than substantive. Regardless of the theoretical framework, rune priests fulfill the same basic functions as librarians in other chapters. They provide psychic support in combat, counter enemy psykers and demons, and advise the Great Wolf on matters involving the supernatural. The rune priests maintain their own hierarchy based on Fenrisian traditions, with senior rune priests training junior ones in the casting of runes, the interpretation of omens, and the channeling of what they term the world spirit of Fenris. The rune priest's integration into Space Wolves' company structure follows patterns distinct from Codex-compliant chapters. Rather than maintaining a separate librarius that deploys individuals to companies as needed, each great company typically includes one or more rune priests who serve as permanent members of that formation. These rune priests develop close working relationships with their great company's Wolf Lord and the other warriors they fight alongside, creating a level of tactical integration that librarians in other chapters might envy. The trade-off comes in reduced flexibility. The Space Wolves cannot easily concentrate psychic power by pulling rune priests from multiple companies for a single operation without disrupting the great company's established command structures. The relationship between the Librarius and other chapter command structures requires careful management to avoid conflicts over authority and resources. The Reclusium maintains responsibility for the chapter's spiritual health and the purity of its warriors' faith, areas that overlap uncomfortably with the Librarius's role in detecting and combating chaos corruption. A chaplain investigating suspected heresy within the chapter might clash with a librarian who insists that psychic examination would provide more reliable evidence than interrogation and observation. These tensions typically resolve through established protocols that define each organization's jurisdiction, though the specifics vary by chapter. Some maintain that the Reclusium holds primacy in all matters of faith and corruption, with the Librarius serving in a support role. Others grant the Librarius independent authority to investigate psychic threats regardless of their source. The Apothecarian's relationship with the Librarius centers on the intersection of biology and psychic phenomena. Apothecaries monitor the physical health of all battle brothers, including librarians, but they lack the expertise to assess psychic strain or warp exposure. A librarian might appear physically healthy while suffering from psychic exhaustion that will manifest as catastrophic loss of control if not addressed. The two organizations must coordinate to ensure that librarians receive appropriate medical care that accounts for both their enhanced physiology and their psychic nature. In chapters like The Blood Angels, where genetic flaws create ongoing medical challenges, this coordination becomes even more critical. The armory maintains the specialized equipment that librarians require, from psychic hoods to force weapons. Tech Marines who work with the Librarius develop expertise in technologies that combine machine spirits with psychic principles, creating tools that respond to their wielders' mental commands and enhance psychic abilities through mechanisms that blur the line between science and sorcery. The Master of the Forge must allocate resources between the Librarius's requests for new or improved equipment and the competing demands of the chapter's other formations. A chief librarian arguing that upgraded psychic hoods would significantly enhance his librarian's effectiveness might find himself in competition with a company captain who insists that his tactical squads need new bolters more urgently. The classification of psychic disciplines into distinct categories represents an organizational framework rather than any fundamental division in the nature of the warp itself. The Imperium Psykers draw upon the same source of power regardless of whether they manifest biomantic healing or pyromantic flame. The Immaterium responds to focused will and shaped thought, channeling energy that exists outside normal physical laws. The disciplines emerged during the Great Crusade as the early librarius organizations attempted to systematize psychic training, identifying common patterns in how different psykers manifested their abilities. A Space Marine whose psychic gift naturally expressed itself through manipulation of biological processes would be trained in biomancy, while another whose abilities manifested as kinetic force would study telekinesis. The framework allowed for structured instruction and the development of techniques that could be taught to others with similar natural inclinations. Biomancy concerns itself with the manipulation of living tissue and the biological processes that sustain life. A biomancer perceives the human body, or any living organism, as a system of interconnected processes that psychic will can influence, accelerate, or redirect. The discipline requires intimate understanding of anatomy and physiology, knowledge that Space Marine librarians acquire through their chapter's extensive training in the biological sciences. A biomancer must know how muscles contract, how bones bear stress, how organs process nutrients and eliminate waste, because his psychic interventions work by enhancing or modifying these natural processes rather than replacing them with purely warp-generated effects. The distinction matters significantly. A biomancer who attempts to heal a wound without understanding the body's natural healing mechanisms risks creating tissue that appears healthy but lacks proper cellular structure or blood supply. The most common battlefield application of biomancy involves the enhancement of physical capabilities beyond even the superhuman baseline that Space Marines normally possess. A librarian skilled in biomancy can flood his own muscles with psychically enhanced oxygen and nutrients, allowing him to strike with force that would shatter his bones under normal circumstances, while simultaneously reinforcing those bones to withstand the stress. The effect resembles the function of the Space Marine's own catalepsian node or biscopia organs, but amplified to levels that gene seed engineering alone cannot achieve. A biomantically enhanced Space Marine might tear through a reinforced bulkhead with his bare hands, lift a rhino transport to free trapped battle brothers underneath, or run at speeds that blur his form to normal human perception. The technique requires careful management of the body's resources and limitations. A biomancer who pushes enhancement too far risks catastrophic tissue failure as muscles tear themselves apart or bones splinter under impossible loads. The psychic energy flowing through the body generates heat that must be dissipated, placing enormous stress on the Space Marine's already enhanced cooling systems. Extended biomantic enhancement leads to rapid exhaustion as the body consumes calories and nutrients at rates that even a Space Marine's efficient metabolism struggles to sustain. Experienced biomancers learn to pulse their enhancements, applying maximum power only for brief moments when critical actions require it, then allowing the body to recover before the next surge. Healing represents biomancy's other primary combat application, though the process differs fundamentally from the miraculous restoration depicted in certain imperial propaganda. A biomancer cannot simply wave his hand and close a wound. He must guide the body's natural healing processes, accelerating cell division, directing blood flow to damaged areas, and psychically knitting torn tissue back together. The technique works best on fresh wounds where the damage pattern remains clear and the body's own healing response has already begun. A bolter wound that has just torn through a Space Marine's torso can be sealed within minutes by a skilled biomancer. The Librarian's psychic will directing stem cells to the injury site and orchestrating their transformation into replacement tissue. More severe injuries require proportionally more time and effort. A Space Marine who has lost a limb cannot have it regrown in the midst of battle. That level of regeneration requires weeks or months of sustained biomantic treatment combined with conventional medical intervention. The biomancer can stabilize the wounded warrior, seal major blood vessels, and ensure that shock does not kill him, but regrowing complex structures like hands or eyes demands cellular-level manipulation over extended periods. Some injuries resist even prolonged biomantic treatment. Damage to gene seed organs, corruption by certain toxins, or wounds inflicted by demon weapons often prove impossible to heal through biomancy alone, requiring the apothecarian's intervention or, in the worst cases, acceptance that the damage is permanent. The application of biomancy against enemies demonstrates the discipline's versatility and lethality. A biomancer can reach out with his psychic senses to perceive an enemy's biological processes, then disrupt them with focused will. The technique might involve accelerating cellular division until tumors bloom throughout the target's body within seconds, or halting the electrical impulses that coordinate heartbeat and breathing. Against unarmored enemies, a biomancer can cause blood to boil in their veins, bones to soften and collapse, or neurons to misfire catastrophically. The deaths that result from these attacks often appear horrific to observers, enemies collapsing as their bodies consume themselves from within, or thrashing in agony as their nervous systems turn against them. Armored targets present greater challenges, but remain vulnerable to biomantic assault. Power armor and even Terminator plate cannot shield the wearer from psychic attack that bypasses physical barriers entirely. A biomancer facing a Chaos Space Marine in full warplate might ignore the armor completely, reaching through it with his psychic senses to target the traitor's biology directly. The technique requires greater focus and power than attacking an unarmored target, as the biomancer must first locate his victim through the armor's mass, then project his will through layers of ceramite and plasteel to reach living tissue. Against opponents with their own psychic defenses or resistance to warp-based attacks, the effort might prove too costly to justify when other disciplines could achieve the same result more efficiently. The risks inherent in biomancy extend beyond simple exhaustion or psychic backlash. A biomancer who regularly manipulates biological processes, particularly his own, risks developing an unhealthy fascination with the malleability of flesh. The ruinous powers, particularly Nurgle and Slaanesh, find biomancers tempting targets for corruption. The Plague God offers knowledge of diseases and biological transformations that far exceed anything a loyal biomancer could safely attempt, while the Prince of Pleasure whispers of sensations and physical modifications that promise transcendence of the body's normal limitations. Librarians trained in biomancy receive extensive instruction in recognizing these temptations and maintaining strict boundaries around what manipulations they will attempt. The line between healing and corruption can blur dangerously when a biomancer begins experimenting with modifications that enhance capability, but alter the fundamental nature of what they affect. Pyromancy and telekinesis represent two aspects of a broader discipline concerned with the projection of force through psychic will. The Imperium's training frameworks typically address them together despite their superficial differences. as both involve imposing the Psyker's intent upon physical reality through direct application of warp energy. A telekinetic creates force through pure psychic pressure, while a pyromancer generates thermal energy that manifests as flame, but the underlying mechanism, channeling power from the Immaterium to affect the material universe, remains fundamentally similar. Librarians who demonstrate aptitude in one often develop capability in the other, though most specialize in the specific applications that suit their combat style and tactical preferences. Telekinesis, in its most basic form, allows a Psyker to move objects without physical contact, exerting force at a distance through focused mental effort. A Lexicanium learning telekinesis begins with simple exercises, lifting small objects, pushing or pulling items across a table, maintaining steady pressure against resistance. These fundamental techniques build the mental architecture necessary for more complex applications. The progression continues through increasingly difficult challenges until the librarian can manipulate multiple objects simultaneously, exert force in precise vectors rather than simple push-pull directions, and maintain telekinetic effects while engaged in physical combat. A fully trained telekinetic can pluck a grenade from mid-flight and hurl it back at the enemy who threw it, hold a blast door closed against enemies trying to force it open, or create a barrier of kinetic force that deflects incoming fire. The combat applications of telekinesis extend far beyond simple object manipulation. A librarian skilled in this discipline can seize an enemy warrior and hurl him across the battlefield with bone-shattering force, crush a target inside his own armor through the application of enormous pressure from all directions simultaneously, or create focused bursts of kinetic energy that strike like invisible hammers. The technique proves particularly effective against enemies who rely on mobility or numerical superiority. A telekinetic can pin multiple attackers in place, holding them immobile while his battle brothers eliminate them with bolter fire, or create zones of turbulent kinetic force that throw enemies off balance and disrupt their formations. The defensive applications of telekinesis provide some of the discipline's most valuable battlefield utility. A librarian can project a barrier of solid force around himself and nearby battle brothers, creating protection equivalent to heavy armor plating through nothing but psychic will. These kind shields deflect incoming fire, turn aside melee weapons, and can even provide some protection against explosive blasts by dissipating the force across the shield's surface rather than allowing it to concentrate on the protected warriors. The technique requires constant focus to maintain. A telekinetic barrier is not a fire-and-forget effect, but an active psychic construct that demands the librarian's attention and energy for as long as it persists. Extended maintenance of defensive barriers leads to rapid exhaustion, forcing the librarian to balance the protection provided against the drain on his reserves. Pyromancy manifests as the generation of extreme heat and flame through psychic means, though the fire a pyromancer creates differs from normal combustion in subtle but important ways. Psychic flame burns hotter than chemical fire, hot enough to melt ceramite or vaporize adamantium, given sufficient intensity and duration. It ignores many of the normal rules governing combustion. Psychic fire can burn in vacuum, underwater, or in environments lacking oxygen entirely, because it draws its energy from the warp rather than chemical reactions. The flame responds to the pyromancer's will, flowing around allies to strike only enemies, or concentrating into narrow streams that cut through armor like industrial cutting torches. A skilled pyromancer can maintain precise control over his flames, adjusting temperature and intensity to achieve specific effects ranging from creating enough heat to trigger ammunition cook-offs in an enemy position to generating an inferno that reduces everything in a target area to ash. The most straightforward application of pyromancy involves projecting gouts of flame at enemies, immolating them where they stand. A pyromancer extends his will toward his targets and channels warp energy through the gesture, manifesting as a stream of fire that leaps from his outstretched hand to engulf his victims. The psychological impact often exceeds the immediate tactical effect, Enemies watching their comrades burn alive tend toward panic and rout even if the flames have not yet reached them. Against certain enemy types, pyromancy proves devastatingly effective. Tyrannid organisms, for all their biological adaptability, burn readily when exposed to temperatures that vaporize their tissues faster than their regeneration can compensate. Orc mobs break and scatter when pyromantic assault reduces their front ranks to charred corpses. Chaos cultists lacking power armor die screaming as psychic fire consumes them. Armored targets require more focused application of pyromantic power. A librarian facing enemies in power armor or vehicles cannot simply bathe them in flame and expect immediate results. He must concentrate his fire into beams of intense heat that cut through protective layers to reach vulnerable components or crew. The technique resembles the use of a meltagun, but offers greater flexibility, as the pyromancer can adjust his attack's characteristics in real time based on what he encounters. Against a Chaos Space Marine in Terminator plate, a pyromancer might focus his flame on the armor's joint seals, heating them until the ceramite cracks and the wearer's mobility becomes compromised. Against a vehicle, he might target vision ports or weapon mounts, blinding the crew or destroying their offensive capability without necessarily penetrating the main armor. The combination of telekinesis and pyromancy in a single librarian's repertoire creates tactical options unavailable to specialists in either discipline alone. A librarian who has mastered both can create walls of flame that hang suspended in mid-air through telekinetic force, establishing barriers that enemies cannot cross without suffering horrific burns. He can use telekinesis to gather loose ammunition, fuel canisters, or other flammable materials into concentrated piles, then ignite them with pyromancy to create massive explosions. Against flying enemies or jump infantry, he can use telekinetic force to arrest their movement mid-flight, holding them in place while pyromantic assault reduces them to falling cinders. The synergy between disciplines allows for creative applications limited only by the librarian's imagination and his ability to maintain focus on multiple psychic effects simultaneously. Divination represents perhaps the most subtle and strategically valuable of the psychic disciplines, though its battlefield applications often prove less immediately dramatic than biomancy's physical enhancements or pyromancy's devastating flames. A diviner perceives the flow of causality and probability, reading the threads of potential futures that extend from each present moment. The technique does not grant perfect foreknowledge. The future remains mutable, constantly shifting as decisions made in the present create new possibilities and foreclose others. What divination provides is insight into likely outcomes, warning of dangers before they manifest, and guidance toward courses of action that lead to favorable results. A skilled diviner fighting alongside his battle brothers can predict enemy movements before they occur, identify ambush positions before the enemy springs their trap, and guide his allies aim toward targets they cannot yet see. The mechanism underlying divination differs from other psychic disciplines in that the diviner does not impose his will upon reality, but instead opens his consciousness to information that already exists within the warp. Every decision, every action, every thought creates ripples in the Immaterium that a sufficiently sensitive psyker can detect and interpret. The past leaves echoes that a diviner can read to understand what has occurred in a location or to an object. The present generates patterns that reveal hidden truths. A diviner can sense when someone lies, detect concealed enemies, or identify which of several paths through dangerous terrain offers the safest passage. The future exists as a constantly shifting web of possibilities, each potential outcome creating its own psychic signature that the diviner perceives and evaluates. Combat applications of divination focus primarily on prediction and guidance. A diviner fighting in close combat perceives his opponent's intended strikes a fraction of a second before they occur, allowing him to position his defense perfectly or to exploit openings that have not yet appeared. The advantage proves decisive when both combatants possess superhuman speed and reflexes. The diviner moves not in reaction to what his enemy does, but in anticipation of what his enemy will do, staying perpetually one step ahead. Against ranged attacks, divination allows the librarian to sense incoming fire and position himself to avoid it, or to know when taking cover is essential versus when he can safely remain exposed. The effect does not make the diviner invulnerable. A sufficiently overwhelming volume of fire will hit regardless of precognitive warning, but it dramatically improves his survival odds in situations where split-second decisions determine life or death. The guidance that diviners provide to their battle brothers extends their personal advantage to entire squads or companies. A diviner can project his precognitive insights to nearby allies, warning them of danger or highlighting targets that will prove critical to the battle's outcome. The technique manifests in various ways depending on the diviner's training and preferences. Some project their visions directly into their allies' minds, others provide verbal warnings and instructions, and some work more subtly by nudging their battle brothers' perceptions toward relevant details without conscious awareness of the psychic intervention. The most skilled diviners coordinate entire formations through their predictions, positioning units to intercept enemy movements before those movements begin, or concentrating fire on targets whose destruction will create cascading failures in the enemy's tactical plan. Strategic-level divination attempts to perceive patterns and outcomes across campaigns or even decades rather than individual battles. A chief librarian might enter deep meditation to divine the likely consequences of different strategic choices facing his chapter master, whether to commit forces to a particular war zone, which enemy leader to prioritize for assassination, or where the chapter's enemies will strike next. These long-range predictions prove far less reliable than combat-scale divination, as the number of variables increases exponentially with the time scale involved. A diviner might perceive that a particular course of action leads to catastrophe, but remain unable to identify the specific mechanism or timing of that catastrophe. The visions often arrive in symbolic or metaphorical form rather than clear images of future events, requiring interpretation that introduces additional uncertainty. The dangers inherent in divination center on the risk of becoming lost in the web of possible futures, or of perceiving threats that do not yet exist and may never manifest. A diviner who looks too deeply into potential futures risks losing his connection to the present, his consciousness scattered across too many timelines to maintain coherent focus on the actual reality he inhabits. Some diviners develop an obsessive need to prevent disasters they have foreseen, even when their visions show only one possibility among thousands, and their attempts at prevention might create worse outcomes. The discipline requires exceptional mental discipline and a philosophical acceptance that not every perceived danger can or should be prevented. A diviner must learn to distinguish between visions that represent genuine warnings, requiring action, and those that show merely one thread among many in the tapestry of possibility. Telepathy encompasses all psychic techniques involving direct mind-to-mind contact, from simple communication to devastating psychic assault. A telepath can project his thoughts into another's consciousness, read surface thoughts, or dive deep into memories, create illusions that seem utterly real to the victim, or simply overwhelm an enemy's mind with psychic force that leaves them catatonic or dead. The discipline requires intimate understanding of how consciousness functions, how memories form and persist, and how perception can be manipulated. Telepaths train extensively in mental architecture, the construction of barriers and compartments within their own minds, because the techniques used to invade another's thoughts can be turned against the telepath by a skilled opponent or by entities from the warp seeking entry into the material realm. Battlefield telepathy most commonly manifests as psychic communication that allows instant, silent coordination between warriors. A telepath can maintain mental links with multiple battle brothers simultaneously, creating a network through which tactical information flows at the speed of thought. The advantage over Vox communication proves substantial. Telepathic links cannot be jammed or intercepted. They function regardless of environmental conditions that would block radio signals, and they allow for the transmission of complex tactical concepts that would require lengthy verbal explanation. A telepath coordinating a squad can share his exact perception of the battlefield with every member, ensuring that all warriors possess identical situational awareness, and can respond to changing conditions with perfect synchronization. Psychic interrogation represents one of telepathy's most valuable intelligence-gathering applications. A telepath can extract information from a prisoner's mind far more efficiently and reliably than physical torture or conventional interrogation techniques. The process involves establishing a mental link with the subject, then navigating through their memories and thoughts to locate relevant information. A skilled telepath can identify when a subject attempts to lie or withhold information, can bypass conscious resistance to access memories the subject has tried to suppress, and can extract data the subject does not consciously realize they possess. The technique proves particularly valuable against enemies who have been conditioned to resist conventional interrogation. A telepath can work around or break through mental conditioning that would defeat normal questioning. The ethics of psychic interrogation remain contentious even within the Imperium's generally utilitarian moral framework. The process inflicts psychological trauma on its subjects, potentially leaving them with permanent mental damage even when the telepath exercises care to minimize harm. Some chapters maintain strict protocols governing when psychic interrogation is permissible and what safeguards must be observed. Others view enemy minds as legitimate targets for any technique that yields useful intelligence, accepting collateral damage to the subject's sanity as an acceptable cost. The Dark Angels Librarians, working in coordination with their chapter's interrogator chaplains, have developed psychic interrogation techniques specifically designed to break the mental conditioning that protects the fallen, methods that most other chapters would consider excessive, if not outright forbidden. Offensive telepathy strikes directly at an enemy's consciousness, bypassing physical defenses entirely. A telepath can project overwhelming psychic force into a target's mind, inducing effects ranging from temporary disorientation to permanent brain death, depending on the power applied and the victim's resistance. Against unprotected minds, normal humans lacking psychic ability or mental conditioning, even a relatively weak telepathic assault proves devastating. The victim experiences sensory overload, their consciousness flooded with input that their brain cannot process, leading to immediate incapacitation or death as neural pathways burn out under the strain. Against more resistant targets like other Space Marines or enemy Psykers, telepathic assault requires greater power and precision, the telepath forcing his will through his opponent's mental defenses to strike at the consciousness beneath. The creation of illusions represents telepathy's most subtle offensive application. A telepath can project false sensory information directly into a target's mind, making them perceive things that do not exist or fail to perceive real threats. The technique proves particularly effective when the illusions align with the target's expectations or fears. A sentry who expects to see empty corridor will more readily accept a telepathic illusion showing exactly that, even if enemies are actually advancing down that corridor in plain sight. More elaborate illusions require proportionally more effort to maintain and prove more difficult to sustain against targets who have reason to question what they perceive. A telepath attempting to make an enemy perceive their own allies as hostile must constantly adjust the illusion to account for inconsistencies that might break the deception. The Immaterium exists as a realm of pure psychic energy where thought and emotion become tangible forces, where the laws of physics hold no dominion, and where entities of malevolent intelligence hunt for opportunities to manifest in real space. Every time a librarian draws upon the warp to fuel his abilities, he creates a connection between his consciousness and this hostile dimension. The act resembles opening a door between two rooms. While the door remains open, things can pass through in both directions. A librarian channeling psychic power to enhance his strength or project flames has opened that door deliberately, but he cannot control what might attempt to pass through from the other side. Demonic entities perceive Psykers as blazing beacons in the warp, their psychic signatures visible across vast distances within the Immaterium. The more powerful the Psyker and the more energy he channels, the brighter that beacon burns and the more attention it attracts. The fundamental danger extends beyond simple detection. When a librarian channels warp energy, his soul becomes temporarily exposed to the Immaterium's denizens. Demons and other hostile entities can attempt to establish a foothold in the Psyker's consciousness during these moments of vulnerability, seeking to corrupt his thoughts, influence his actions, or in the worst cases, seize control of his body entirely. The process does not require the librarian to make any obvious mistake or to deliberately invite such contact. Merely using his abilities creates the opportunity for demonic interference. A librarian who has successfully channeled the same biomantic enhancement technique 1,000 times might find that on the 1,001st attempt, something notices his psychic signature and reaches through the connection he has created. Possession represents the ultimate catastrophe that can befall a librarian, though the process differs substantially from the sudden dramatic transformations depicted in certain Imperial propaganda. A demon cannot simply leap into a Space Marine's body the instant he uses his psychic abilities. The gene seed modifications, psychic training, and mental conditioning that create a librarian provide substantial resistance to such crude attempts at invasion. Instead, possession typically occurs through gradual erosion of the librarian's defenses, the demon working patiently to establish influence over time rather than attempting immediate takeover. The entity might begin by planting thoughts that the librarian believes are his own, subtle suggestions that push him toward actions that weaken his mental barriers or isolate him from his battle brothers. Over weeks or months, the demon's influence grows as the librarian unknowingly cooperates with his own corruption. The signs of early-stage possession often prove difficult to distinguish from normal stress, exhaustion, or personality changes that any warrior might experience across centuries of service. A librarian might become more irritable or withdrawn, might begin questioning doctrines he previously accepted without hesitation, or might develop unusual interests in forbidden topics. His battle brothers might notice minor behavioral changes, a tendency to volunteer for solo missions, reluctance to participate in chapter rituals, or subtle shifts in his psychic signature that other librarians perceive as somehow wrong without being able to articulate exactly what has changed. These warning signs require careful observation to detect, and even when noticed, they might be attributed to mundane causes rather than demonic influence. Advanced possession manifests in ways that leave little room for doubt. The librarian's psychic abilities might surge unpredictably, demonstrating power levels beyond what he has previously achieved, but with control that deteriorates proportionally. His eyes might show a faint luminescence in darkness, or his shadow might move independently of his body. Physical changes can occur as the demon's presence begins reshaping its host, skin developing an unhealthy pallor, wounds healing in ways that leave unnatural scarring, or the librarian's voice taking on subtle harmonics that suggest multiple entities speaking simultaneously. By this stage, the possession has progressed beyond any possibility of exorcism through conventional means. The demon has intertwined itself so thoroughly with the librarian's soul that separating them would destroy what remains of the original personality. The response protocols that chapters maintain for dealing with compromised librarians reflect the serious threat that a possessed Space Marine represents. A corrupted librarian combines the combat capabilities of a Space Marine with psychic powers potentially amplified by demonic influence, making him extraordinarily dangerous to his former battle brothers. Most chapters maintain standing orders that suspected possession cases must be reported immediately to the chief librarian and the master of sanctity, with the affected librarian placed under constant observation pending investigation. If possession is confirmed, execution becomes the only viable option in the vast majority of cases. The Imperium possesses no reliable method for exorcising demons from Space Marines without killing the host, and the risk of the possessed librarian escaping or spreading corruption to others outweighs any value his survival might provide. The perils of the warp represent a broader category of psychic phenomena that can manifest whenever a librarian channels power from the Immaterium, ranging from minor nuisances to catastrophic disasters. The Imperium's classification system organizes these phenomena by severity and frequency, though the boundaries between categories remain imprecise. Minor perils might include brief sensory distortions, temporary exhaustion beyond what the psychic effort itself would normally cause, or small-scale environmental effects like flickering lights or sudden temperature drops. These incidents occur relatively frequently during psychic activity and generally resolve themselves within moments without lasting consequences. A librarian experiencing minor perils might feel momentary disorientation or notice that nearby equipment malfunctions briefly, but he can typically continue his activities without significant disruption. Moderate perils escalate the danger substantially. These manifestations might include psychic feedback that causes physical injury to the librarian, uncontrolled bursts of psychic energy that damage the surrounding environment or harm nearby individuals, or brief manifestations of warp entities that dissipate before fully entering real space. A librarian who triggers moderate perils while channeling biomancy might find the enhancement effect backfiring, causing tissue damage instead of strengthening his body. One attempting telekinesis might lose control of the forces he has summoned, causing objects to fly about randomly rather than following his intended direction. Pyromantic techniques gone wrong can result in flames spreading beyond the librarian's control, potentially injuring allies or consuming resources the chapter cannot afford to lose. The physical manifestations that accompany moderate perils often prove disturbing to witnesses even when they cause no immediate harm. Reality might temporarily thin around the librarian, creating visual distortions where the warp bleeds through into normal space. Observers might glimpse impossible colors, perceive sounds that have no physical source, or experience brief tactile sensations of things brushing against them, despite nothing being present. The air around the librarian might crackle with visible energy, or shadows might move in ways that defy the position of light sources. These phenomena typically last only seconds, but they serve as stark reminders that psychic power draws upon forces that exist outside natural law and that resist complete control even by the most disciplined practitioners. Catastrophic perils represent the nightmare scenario that all librarians train to prevent but know they cannot eliminate entirely as a possibility. These events involve full demonic manifestation, massive uncontrolled releases of warp energy, or the creation of temporary rifts between real space and the Immaterium. A catastrophic peril might result in a demon physically manifesting where the librarian stands, using his body as an anchor point to force its way into reality. The entity might be a lesser demon that a squad of Space Marines can destroy through concentrated fire, or it might be something far more dangerous that requires sustained combat to banish. In the worst cases, the manifestation might create a stable warp rift that allows additional entities to pour through, potentially overwhelming the chapter's immediate response capabilities. The environmental damage from catastrophic perils can prove as dangerous as any demon. Uncontrolled warp energy released during a catastrophic failure might age or corrode everything within a certain radius, turning ceramite brittle and causing machinery to seize as if centuries had passed in seconds. The local gravity might fluctuate wildly, crushing some individuals while causing others to float helplessly. Time itself can become unstable in the affected area, with some observers experiencing events at normal speed, while others perceive everything moving at a fraction of normal rate or impossibly accelerated. These distortions typically collapse within minutes as reality reasserts itself, but the damage they cause during their brief existence can prove extensive. The triggers that cause perils to manifest remain imperfectly understood despite millennia of study by the Imperium's psychic institutions. Exhaustion increases the likelihood of perils occurring, as a fatigued librarian struggles to maintain the mental discipline necessary for safe psychic channeling. Attempting to channel more power than the librarian's training and natural ability can safely handle dramatically increases peril risk. A lexicanium trying to perform techniques that would challenge an epistolary court's disaster. Environmental factors play a role as well. Areas where the barrier between real space and the warp has thinned, near active warp rifts on demon worlds, or in locations where massive violence has occurred, make perils more likely and more severe when they occur. Certain Xenos artifacts or chaos-corrupted items can interfere with psychic channeling, introducing instabilities that the librarian might not detect until perils manifest. The psychic hood serves as the primary piece of equipment that librarians employ to reduce the risk of perils and to enhance their control over channeled power. The device consists of a neural interface that connects directly to the librarian's black carapace and cranial implants, coupled with psychically reactive materials that help focus and stabilize warp energy as it flows through the wearer. The hood's design varies significantly between chapters, reflecting both aesthetic preferences and different technological traditions. An ultramarine psychic hood might feature clean lines and integrated targeting systems, while a Space Wolves Rune Priest's hood incorporates carved bone and ritual inscriptions that serve both decorative and functional purposes. Despite these superficial differences, all psychic hoods operate on similar principles. They provide a structured pathway for psychic energy that reduces the likelihood of uncontrolled manifestations. The hood functions partly through physical mechanisms and partly through principles that blur the line between technology and sorcery. Psychically reactive crystals embedded in the device resonate with the librarian's mental patterns, helping to stabilize his connection to the warp. Neural interfaces feed real-time data about the librarian's psychic state to his conscious awareness, providing warning when he approaches dangerous levels of warp exposure or when his mental defenses begin to deteriorate. Some hoods incorporate additional features like enhanced sensory systems that help the librarian detect psychic phenomena in his environment, or defensive matrices that provide some protection against hostile psychic attack. The most sophisticated psychic hoods, worn by chief librarians and other senior officers, might include archaeotech components whose function the chapter's techmarines can maintain but no longer fully understand. Hexagrammic wards represent another layer of protection that chapters employ to safeguard their librarians and their fortress monasteries against demonic incursion. These wards consist of carefully inscribed symbols and patterns that create zones of psychic stability, making it more difficult for demons to manifest and limiting the severity of perils that occur within the protected area. The hexagrammic patterns derive from knowledge preserved since the dark age of technology, mathematical formulae that describe stable configurations of psychic energy. A properly constructed hexagrammic ward does not block psychic power. Librarians within a warded area can still channel their abilities normally, but it constrains how warp energy can flow, preventing the chaotic fluctuations that allow demonic entities to force their way into reality. The construction and maintenance of hexagrammic wards requires specialized knowledge that most chapters preserve within their librarius. The patterns must be inscribed with absolute precision, as even minor errors can render the ward ineffective or potentially create vulnerabilities that demons can exploit. The materials used for the inscriptions matter as well. Silver, gold, and certain blessed ceramics prove most effective, while iron and steel provide lesser but still useful protection. The wards must be regularly inspected and renewed, as normal wear or deliberate sabotage can compromise their integrity. Many fortress monasteries feature permanent hexagrammic wards inscribed into the walls and floors of critical locations like the librarius training chambers, the chapter's reliquary, and the command centers where senior officers coordinate operations. Chapter-specific rituals and traditions provide additional layers of protection that complement the physical safeguards of hoods and wards. These practices vary dramatically between chapters, reflecting different cultural backgrounds and theological interpretations of how best to resist demonic corruption. The Black Templars, despite their general distrust of Psykers, maintain elaborate benediction rituals that their chaplains perform over any librarians who serve alongside their crusades. The ritual involves anointing the librarian with sacred oils while reciting prayers that invoke the Emperor's protection, creating what the Black Templars believe to be a shield of faith around the Psyker. Whether the ritual's effectiveness derives from genuine divine intervention, from psychosomatic effects that help the librarian maintain mental discipline, or from some combination of both, remains a matter of theological debate. The Blood Angels incorporate their librarians into the chapter's sanguinary rituals, using the psychic bond between all sons of Sanguinius as an additional anchor against corruption. Blood Angels librarians learn to draw strength from their connection to their battle brothers, using the shared genetic legacy as a foundation for their mental defenses. The technique proves particularly valuable when combating the Red Thirst or the Black Rage, as the librarian can lean on the collective willpower of the chapter rather than relying solely on his individual resistance. The approach carries its own risks. A Blood Angels librarian who falls to corruption might potentially spread that corruption through the psychic bonds he shares with his brothers, creating cascading failures across multiple warriors. The Dark Angels maintain rituals of abjuration that their librarians perform before and after every use of their psychic abilities, formal recitations that serve to compartmentalize the psychic experience and prevent it from bleeding into the librarian's normal consciousness. The rituals include specific phrases in languages that predate the Imperium, words whose meaning has been lost, but whose psychic resonance remains effective. Dark Angels librarians spend years memorizing these rituals and practicing their precise execution, as any deviation from the established forms might compromise the protection they provide. The chapter's obsessive secrecy extends to these practices. The specific rituals used by Dark Angels librarians remain unknown to outsiders, shared only with those who have been inducted into the inner circle. Mantras of abjuration serve as mental anchors that librarians employ during psychic channeling, repetitive phrases or concepts that help maintain focus and resist external influence. A librarian under psychic assault might recite his chapter's founding principles, might focus on memories of his battle brothers, or might repeat mathematical sequences that occupy the conscious mind, while deeper mental processes handle the actual psychic work. The specific content of the mantra matters less than its ability to provide structure and stability to the librarian's consciousness. Some chapters teach standardized mantras to all their librarians, while others encourage each psyker to develop personal mantras that resonate with their individual psychology. The role of faith as a shield against corruption represents one of the most contentious theological questions within the Imperium's psychic institutions. The Imperial Creed maintains that faith in the Emperor provides genuine protection against the ruinous powers, that a soul sufficiently devoted to the Master of Mankind cannot be corrupted regardless of the temptations or threats arrayed against it. The Ecclesiarchy points to numerous examples of faithful Imperial servants who resisted demonic possession through prayer and devotion, while those who lacked such faith fell quickly to corruption. Librarians, however, occupy an uncomfortable position within this theological framework. Their psychic abilities mark them as different from normal humanity, potentially suspect in the eyes of the most orthodox faithful, yet they claim the same devotion to the Emperor as any other Space Marine. Most chapters resolve this tension by incorporating faith-based practices into their librarians' training and daily routines, without treating faith as a substitute for proper psychic discipline. A librarian begins and ends each day with prayers to the Emperor, participates in chapter rituals alongside his battle brothers, and maintains the same devotion to the chapter's spiritual traditions as any non-psychic Space Marine. This faith provides psychological reinforcement for the mental disciplines that form the primary defense against corruption. A librarian who believes the Emperor watches over him and protects him from demonic influence will maintain his mental defenses more consistently than one who relies solely on technique. Whether this effect represents genuine divine intervention or simply the power of belief remains unknowable, and most librarians consider the question irrelevant. If faith helps them resist corruption, the mechanism behind that resistance matters less than the practical result. Notable cases of librarian corruption throughout Imperial history serve as cautionary examples that all chapters study during their Psykers training. The Fall of the Thousand Suns remains the most prominent example, demonstrating how an entire legion's worth of librarians could be corrupted despite possessing the most sophisticated psychic training in the Imperium. The lesson most chapters draw from Prospero is not that psychic ability inevitably leads to corruption, but that arrogance and the belief that one has transcended the dangers of the warp create the exact vulnerabilities that allow corruption to take root. Magnus, the Red, believed his knowledge and power made him immune to the ruinous power's influence, and that belief blinded him to the trap being set until it was too late to escape. The astral claws fall to chaos during the Badab War included the corruption of several librarians who had previously served the Imperium with distinction. These warriors did not fall suddenly or dramatically, but gradually, over years of isolation and growing resentment toward the Imperium they believed had abandoned them. The corruption manifested first as minor ethical compromises, using psychic interrogation techniques that exceeded approved protocols, channeling slightly more power than safety guidelines recommended, experimenting with psychic techniques that skirted the boundaries of what the Codex Astartes permitted. Each individual transgression seemed minor, but collectively, they eroded the mental disciplines that should have protected these librarians from corruption. By the time the Astral Claws openly rebelled, their librarians had become sorcerers in all but name, wielding powers drawn from the warp without the safeguards that loyal chapters maintained. The warning signs that indicate a librarian might be succumbing to corruption extend beyond the obvious physical manifestations that accompany advanced possession. Changes in psychic signature represent one of the earliest detectable indicators. Other librarians might perceive that a battle brother's psychic presence feels subtly wrong, carrying undertones that suggest external influence or contamination. The affected librarian might begin demonstrating abilities beyond what his training and experience should permit, achieving results that seem too easy or too powerful given his known capabilities. His personality might shift in subtle ways, becoming more secretive, more willing to bend rules that he previously respected, or more interested in forbidden knowledge. These changes often occur gradually enough that the librarian himself might not recognize what is happening, believing his evolution represents natural growth rather than corruption. Physical symptoms can include chronic exhaustion that does not respond to normal rest, persistent headaches or sensory distortions, or wounds that heal abnormally slowly despite biomantic treatment. The librarian might report disturbing dreams or visions that persist even when he is not actively using his psychic abilities, suggesting that his mental barriers have become compromised and that external entities can reach his consciousness even during periods when he should be protected. Changes in behavior towards sacred objects or chapter rituals can prove telling. A corrupted librarian might show reluctance to participate in benediction ceremonies, might experience discomfort when handling blessed weapons or relics, or might begin questioning doctrines that he previously accepted without hesitation. Chapter responses to suspected corruption vary based on the evidence available and the seriousness of the suspected compromise. In cases where corruption remains uncertain, the chief librarian typically orders the suspected librarian placed under observation while continuing to perform his duties, with senior librarians monitoring his psychic signature and behavior for confirmation. If the suspicion proves unfounded, the librarian returns to normal service with no lasting consequences beyond the temporary scrutiny. If evidence of corruption emerges, the response escalates rapidly. The suspected librarian is confined and subjected to intensive psychic examination by multiple senior librarians working in concert, their combined abilities allowing them to detect corruption that might evade a single examiner. Confirmed corruption leaves the chapter with few options beyond execution. Some chapters maintain that even a librarian in the early stages of possession might be saved through intensive purification rituals, psychic cleansing, and spiritual counseling, but the success rate of such interventions remains extremely low. The demon's influence typically proves too deeply rooted to remove without destroying the host's consciousness in the process. Most chapters conclude that the risk of attempting to save a corrupted librarian outweighs any potential benefit, particularly given the danger that the possessed Space Marine represents to his battle brothers. The execution is typically carried out by the chief librarian or another senior member of the Librarius, with the Master of Sanctity present to perform the appropriate funerary rites and to ensure that the corrupted warrior's gene seed is destroyed rather than recovered for future use. The psychological impact of discovering corruption within the Librarius extends beyond the immediate loss of a battle brother. Every librarian understands that he could potentially fall to the same corruption, that his training and devotion provide protection but not absolute immunity. When a battle brother does fall, it forces the entire Librarius to confront their own vulnerability and to question whether their safeguards prove adequate. The chief librarian must balance the need for vigilance against the danger of creating an atmosphere of paranoia, where librarians fear to report problems or seek help when they experience difficulties. Some chapters respond to corruption cases by tightening their protocols and increasing oversight of all librarians, while others maintain that excessive restrictions and surveillance create their own problems by undermining the trust and autonomy that librarians require to function effectively. The identification of psychic potential in Space Marine aspirants begins long before the first gene seed organ is implanted, though the process proves far less reliable than the Imperium's psychic screening protocols for normal human populations. The standard testing methods employed by the Scholastica Psychona, measuring responses to psychically charged stimuli, observing for involuntary manifestations of power, analyzing genetic markers associated with psychic mutation, work adequately when applied to baseline humans, but become complicated when dealing with children who will undergo the transformation into Space Marines. The gene seed implantation process itself can trigger latent abilities that showed no signs of manifesting beforehand, or it can amplify minor psychic sensitivity into full-fledged power. A youth who passes every screening test as psychically null might develop abilities after receiving his secondary heart or his osmodula, the interaction between the gene seed organs and his existing genetics creating conditions for powers to emerge. Most chapters conduct preliminary psychic screening during their initial aspirant selection, attempting to identify candidates with active or latent abilities before beginning the implantation process. The methods vary based on available resources and chapter traditions. The Blood Angels employ specialized sanguinary priests who possess limited psychic sensitivity themselves, allowing them to detect the faint signatures that indicate potential. These priests observe aspirants during the trials that determine who will receive the gene seed, watching for moments when stress or fear trigger involuntary psychic phenomena. A youth who causes candles to flicker when frightened, who seems to know what lies around corners before seeing it, or who demonstrates uncanny luck that defies statistical probability, might possess latent abilities worth investigating further. The screening remains imperfect. Many psychically gifted aspirants show no obvious signs during the trials, while some phenomena that appear psychic prove to be nothing more than coincidence or the natural hyper-awareness that makes a youth suitable for transformation into a Space Marine regardless of psychic ability. The Space Wolves approach the identification process through their own cultural framework, with the Wolf Priests observing aspirants for signs of what they term the gift of the storm. Fenrisian tradition holds that certain warriors possess an innate connection to the world spirit of their homeworld, manifesting as unusual affinity with weather patterns, animals, or the telling of futures through rune casting. The Wolf Priests watch for these signs during the trials that aspirants undergo, noting which youths demonstrate capabilities that exceed normal human limits even before gene seed implantation. A youth who calms a pack of Fenrisian wolves through presence alone, who predicts storms with uncanny accuracy, or who experiences prophetic dreams might be marked for eventual training as a rune priest should he survive the transformation process. The Space Wolves maintain that they are not identifying Psykers, but rather those blessed by Fenris itself, though the practical distinction between these categories remains minimal to outside observers. Chapters that recruit from civilized or hive worlds face different challenges in identifying psychic potential among their aspirants. These worlds typically maintain their own psychic screening programs as part of the Imperium's broader efforts to identify and control Psykers before they become dangerous. A youth with active psychic abilities would normally be taken by the Black Ships for processing through the Scholastica Psychona's facilities on Terra, never reaching the point where a Space Marine chapter might recruit him. The chapters must therefore focus their screening on identifying latent potential that has escaped the notice of planetary authorities, abilities so subtle or so well hidden that the youth has reached recruitment age without being flagged as a Psyker. This requires more sophisticated testing than what feral world chapters employ, often involving exposure to psychically charged artifacts while monitoring for responses that indicate sensitivity. The Ultramarines maintain testing facilities within their recruitment centers across the 500 worlds, chambers where aspirants are exposed to carefully controlled psychic stimuli, while librarians observe their reactions from behind protective wards. The stimuli might include artifacts that generate low-level psychic fields, recordings of psychic phenomena captured during previous operations, or even the presence of servitors that have been psychically modified to emit specific signatures. Aspirants who demonstrate measurable responses, changes in biorhythms, involuntary physical reactions, or reported sensory experiences that correspond to the psychic stimuli receive additional screening to determine whether they possess genuine psychic potential or merely heightened sensitivity to environmental factors. The process identifies perhaps one potential psyker for every several hundred aspirants tested, a rate consistent with the general human population's psychic manifestation frequency. The gene seed implantation process itself serves as an unintended secondary screening mechanism for psychic ability. The transformation from human to space marine places enormous stress on every system in the aspirant's body, pushing his physiology to its absolute limits as the gene seed organs take root and begin reshaping him. This stress can trigger the manifestation of latent psychic abilities that might have remained dormant throughout the aspirant's entire natural lifespan. A youth who showed no signs of psychic potential during screening might suddenly demonstrate abilities during the implantation process, his powers emerging as his body and mind struggle to adapt to the changes being forced upon them. These manifestations often occur during the most dangerous phases of the transformation, when the neuroglottis is implanted and begins rewiring neural pathways, or when the catalepsian node activates for the first time and the aspirant's consciousness must adapt to altered sleep patterns. The manifestations that occur during gene seed implantation tend toward the uncontrolled and dangerous, as the aspirant lacks any training in managing psychic power and may not even understand what is happening to him. An aspirant whose telekinetic abilities suddenly activate might cause objects throughout the implantation chamber to fly about randomly, potentially injuring the apothecaries attending him or damaging critical medical equipment. One whose pyromantic gifts emerge might generate enough heat to scorch his own flesh or set fire to his surroundings, despite the supposedly controlled environment of the implantation facility. Biomantic manifestations can prove particularly disturbing, as the aspirant's newly emerged abilities interact unpredictably with the gene seed organs already reshaping his body, potentially causing mutations or growth patterns that diverge from the intended transformation process. Chapters maintain protocols for handling psychic manifestations during implantation, though the specific procedures vary based on how frequently the chapter encounters such incidents and what resources they can dedicate to managing them. Most facilities include at least one librarian on standby during implantation procedures, positioned to intervene if an aspirant demonstrates psychic activity. The librarian can suppress uncontrolled manifestations through his own abilities, preventing the aspirant from harming himself or others, while the apothecaries complete the implantation process. In cases where the manifestation proves too powerful or too unstable for safe containment, the protocols typically call for the aspirant's immediate termination, a harsh response, but one justified by the danger that an out-of-control psyker represents within a fortress monastery. The gene seed is recovered if possible, though organs exposed to uncontrolled psychic energy during manifestation often prove too damaged for future use. Aspirants who survive both the gene seed implantation and any psychic manifestations that occur during the process enter the standard training regimen that all Space Marine neophytes undergo. They learn to use their enhanced bodies to maintain and employ the weapons of the Adeptus Astartes, to operate in squad formations, and to execute the tactical doctrines their chapter favors. The psychic abilities that mark them as different receive no special attention during this phase, the neophyte must first prove himself capable of functioning as a basic battle brother before the chapter invests additional resources in developing his psychic gifts. This approach serves multiple purposes. It ensures that every librarian possesses the fundamental combat skills that all Space Marines require, preventing them from becoming specialists so focused on their psychic abilities that they cannot function effectively when those abilities prove insufficient. It also provides time for the neophyte's psychic abilities to stabilize following the trauma of implantation and transformation. The dual nature of librarian training becomes apparent only after the neophyte completes his basic instruction and receives his power armor, at which point the chapter's librarius begins his specialized education in earnest. The neophyte finds himself pulled between two demanding training regimens that often seem to work at cross purposes. His company captain expects him to maintain proficiency in all standard Astartes combat skills, to participate in training exercises with his squad, and to deploy on operations alongside his battle brothers. The librarius demands increasing amounts of his time for psychic instruction, meditation exercises that can consume hours or even days, and study of texts covering psychic theory and the nature of the warp. The neophyte must learn to balance these competing demands while adapting to the reality that his psychic abilities set him apart from the battle brothers he trained alongside during his initial instruction. The psychic training begins with the most fundamental skill any psyker must master, the ability to perceive and control the flow of warp energy through his own consciousness. A neophyte librarian learns to sense the presence of psychic power, to distinguish it from normal sensory input, and to consciously activate and deactivate his connection to the Immaterium. The exercises start simple. The instructor, typically a codiceer or epistolary assigned to train junior librarians, demonstrates a basic psychic effect while the neophyte observes with his psychic senses. The neophyte learns to identify the signature of psychic activity, to recognize the feeling of warp energy being channeled nearby. He practices opening and closing his psychic awareness, learning to shield his mind from external psychic phenomena when necessary while remaining able to detect threats that require his attention. The progression continues with exercises in basic energy manipulation, the neophyte learning to draw small amounts of power from the warp and shape it according to his will. He might be instructed to levitate a small object, to generate enough heat to light a candle, or to project his thoughts into his instructor's mind. These initial attempts often fail completely or produce results wildly different from what the neophyte intended. A telekinetic exercise might result in the target object exploding rather than floating, or in every loose object in the training chamber suddenly flying toward the neophyte instead of the intended target moving away from him. Pyromantic attempts might generate ice instead of flame, or might produce heat but no visible fire, or might create flames that burn cold rather than hot. The failures serve as learning experiences, each one teaching the neophyte something about how psychic power responds to focused will and how his particular abilities manifest. The mental disciplines that allow safe psychic practice receive equal emphasis with the practical exercises in energy manipulation. The neophyte learns to construct barriers within his own mind, compartmentalizing his psychic abilities so that they remain contained until deliberately activated. He practices mantras of abjuration, repetitive mental exercises that help maintain focus and resist external influence when channeling power. The instructors drill him relentlessly on the signs of impending psychic peril, teaching him to recognize when he is pushing too hard or when external entities are attempting to interfere with his channeling. The neophyte learns to monitor his own mental state constantly, watching for the subtle changes in perception or thought patterns that might indicate the beginning stages of corruption or possession. The role of the Scholastica Psychana in Space Marine Librarian training remains limited despite that institution's central importance to the Imperium's broader psychic infrastructure. The Scholastica Psychana operates facilities across the Imperium where human Psykers are trained for service as sanctioned Psykers, astropaths, or other specialized roles. These facilities possess vast accumulated knowledge about psychic phenomena and training techniques developed across millennia of working with Psykers of every conceivable type and power level. In theory, the Scholastica Psychona could provide valuable support to chapters training their librarians, offering expertise and resources that individual chapters might lack. In practice, most chapters maintain jealous control over their librarian training programs and resist external interference in what they consider an internal chapter matter. The relationship between the Scholastica Psychona and the Adeptus Astartes reflects broader tensions about authority and autonomy within the Imperium's complex power structures. The Scholastica Psychona answers to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, which in turn operates under the authority of the High Lords of Terra. Space Marine chapters, particularly first founding chapters and their successors, maintain that they answer only to the Emperor himself and that their internal affairs remain outside the jurisdiction of other imperial institutions. The idea that the Scholastica Psychona might have authority over how chapters train their librarians, or that chapters should be required to send their psychically gifted neophytes to Scholastica facilities for instruction, strikes most chapter masters as unacceptable infringement on their independence. The chapters argue that Space Marine physiology and the specific requirements of Astartes combat make their librarians fundamentally different from other Imperial Psykers, requiring specialized training that only other Space Marines can properly provide. Some chapters do maintain working relationships with the Scholastica Psychona, though these arrangements typically involve consultation and information sharing rather than direct training. A chief librarian might request access to Scholastica Psychona archives when researching a particular type of psychic phenomenon his chapter has encountered, or might consult with senior instructors from the Scholastica about training techniques for dealing with especially powerful or unstable psychic manifestations. The Scholastica Psychona benefits from these relationships as well, gaining access to information about psychic threats that Space Marine chapters encounter and learning from the Astartes' experiences in combating enemies that normal human Psykers would have no hope of surviving against. The exchange remains carefully bounded, with both sides maintaining clear limits on what information they share and what authority they acknowledge the other as possessing. The progression through the ranks of the Librarius corresponds to measurable increases in both psychic power and the control necessary to wield that power safely. A neophyte who has completed his basic psychic training and demonstrated reliable control over at least one discipline might be elevated to Lexicanium, the first formal rank within the Librarius. The promotion marks the point where the chapter judges the young librarian ready for combat deployment, though he remains under close supervision and typically operates attached to a company rather than independently. The Lexicanium continues his training even as he begins participating in actual operations, learning to apply his abilities under battlefield conditions where the stress and chaos make maintaining proper mental discipline far more difficult than in controlled training environments. The trials that mark progression from one rank to the next within the Librarius vary by chapter, but typically include both demonstrations of psychic capability and tests of the librarian's judgment and resistance to corruption. A Lexicanium seeking promotion to Codiceer might be required to demonstrate mastery of multiple psychic disciplines, to successfully counter psychic attacks from senior librarians in controlled duels, and to show that he can maintain his abilities across extended campaigns without succumbing to exhaustion or making errors that endanger his battle brothers. The testing often includes deliberate exposure to corrupting influences in controlled settings. The candidate might be required to examine chaos-tainted artifacts while maintaining his mental defenses, or to resist psychic assaults designed to mimic demonic attempts at possession. These tests carry real danger, as the exposure to corruption remains genuine even though the setting is controlled, but they provide the only reliable way to verify that a librarian possesses the resistance necessary for promotion to positions of greater responsibility. Psychic duels between librarians serve both as training exercises and as formal tests of capability, though the practice remains controversial within some chapters. The duels involve two Psykers engaging in direct psychic combat, each attempting to overcome the other's mental defenses through application of their abilities. The contests might focus on specific disciplines, two biomancers competing to see who can enhance their physical capabilities more effectively, or two telepaths attempting to breach each other's mental barriers, or they might allow unrestricted use of all abilities the participants possess. Safety protocols limit the damage that dueling librarians can inflict on each other, with senior librarians standing ready to intervene if the contest threatens to cause permanent harm, but injuries remain common and fatalities have occurred when duels escalated beyond the participants' ability to control. The Blood Angels incorporate psychic dueling into their librarian training more extensively than most chapters. Viewing the practice as essential preparation for the mental battles, their librarians must fight against the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. Blood Angels librarians learn to attack and defend simultaneously, maintaining their own mental integrity while projecting force against an opponent who is doing the same. The duels teach them to recognize when they are being psychically influenced, to distinguish between their own thoughts and those being projected into their minds by an external source, and to maintain combat effectiveness even while under sustained psychic assault. The chapter accepts the risks inherent in the practice as necessary costs of ensuring their librarians can function effectively in the psychically hostile environments they regularly encounter. The Space Wolves reject formal psychic dueling as contrary to their traditions, though their rune priests engage in contests that serve similar purposes under different names. Fenrisian tradition includes various challenges and competitions through which warriors prove their prowess, and the rune priests have adapted these traditions to psychic combat. Two rune priests might compete to see who can more accurately predict the outcome of battles through rune casting and divination, or who can maintain psychic wards against attacks from training servitors modified to simulate demonic assault. The Space Wolves frame these contests as demonstrations of spiritual strength and connection to Fenris rather than as psychic dueling, but the practical effect remains similar to what other chapters achieve through more formalized testing. Controlled exposure to warp phenomena represents one of the most dangerous aspects of librarian training, yet most chapters consider it essential preparation for the threats their Psykers will face in actual combat. A librarian who has never encountered a demon in controlled circumstances, who has not experienced the psychic pressure that chaos corruption generates, or who has not felt the pull of the warp attempting to overwhelm his defenses will prove dangerously unprepared when he faces these threats for the first time during actual operations. The training must therefore include exposure to genuine warp phenomena despite the risks involved. Chapters maintain specialized facilities for this purpose, chambers where chaos-tainted artifacts can be safely studied, where captured demons can be contained for observation, or where psychic phenomena can be generated under controlled conditions that allow for immediate intervention if the trainee shows signs of being overwhelmed. The artifacts used in these training exercises typically represent minor chaos contamination rather than items of significant power. A blade that has tasted demonic blood but carries no active intelligence. A text describing chaos rituals but lacking the psychic charge that would make reading it genuinely dangerous. Or fragments of armor worn by traitor Space Marines that retain traces of their former owner's corruption. The trainee librarian must examine these items psychically, learning to identify the signatures of chaos taint and to maintain his mental defenses while in proximity to corrupting influences. Senior librarians monitor the exercises constantly, ready to intervene if the trainee shows signs of being affected by what he is examining. The exposure remains brief and carefully controlled, but it provides invaluable experience in recognizing how chaos corruption manifests psychically and what it feels like to resist its pull. The crafting of psychic focuses represents a rite of passage for librarians in many chapters, though the specific traditions vary widely. A psychic focus serves as a tool that helps the librarian channel and control his abilities, providing a physical anchor for psychic energies that might otherwise prove difficult to direct precisely. The focus might take the form of a staff, a sword, a book, or any other object that holds personal significance for the librarian. The crafting process involves more than simply creating or acquiring the physical object. The librarian must attune the focus to his own psychic signature through extended meditation and ritual, essentially imprinting part of his consciousness into the item. A properly attuned focus responds to its creators will more readily than raw warp energy does, allowing for more precise control and reducing the likelihood of perils manifesting during psychic channeling. The Dark Angels maintain particularly elaborate traditions around the crafting of psychic focuses, with each librarian expected to create his own force weapon as part of his progression through the ranks. The process begins with the selection of materials, the librarian choosing metals and components that resonate with his psychic nature. He works alongside the chapter's tech marines to forge the physical weapon, participating directly in every stage of its creation. Once the weapon exists in physical form, the librarian spends weeks or months in meditation, gradually infusing the blade with psychic energy until it becomes an extension of his own will. The completed force weapon serves as both a physical armament and a psychic focus, capable of channeling the librarian's powers to devastating effect, while also providing a measure of protection against hostile psychic attack. The Blood Angels approach psychic focus, crafting through their chapter's artistic traditions, with librarians often creating elaborate works that serve both aesthetic and functional purposes. A Blood Angels librarian might craft a psychic focus in the form of a beautifully illuminated manuscript containing the chapter's history and his own meditations on the nature of psychic power, the physical beauty of the work reflecting the librarian's attempt to impose order and meaning on the chaotic energies he channels. Others create sculptures, paintings, or musical compositions that serve as anchors for their psychic abilities, the creative process itself becoming a form of meditation that deepens their connection to their powers while maintaining the mental discipline necessary to wield those powers safely. The Space Wolves maintain that their rune priests practice something fundamentally distinct from the psychic disciplines employed by other chapters' librarians, a claim that has generated controversy since before the Council of Nikaea. The 6th Legion's position holds that rune priests draw their power from the world spirit of Fenris itself, rather than from the warp, channeling natural forces inherent to their homeworld, instead of tapping into the Immaterium that other Psykers access. The distinction matters enormously to the Space Wolves, who view it as the difference between sacred shamanic tradition and dangerous sorcery. To outside observers, including librarians from other chapters and the Adeptus Astartes representatives, the difference appears semantic at best. A rune priest channeling lightning to strike down enemies or divining future events through the casting of runes employs the same fundamental mechanisms as any other Psyker, regardless of what cultural framework he uses to understand his abilities. The training that creates a rune priest begins long before gene seed implantation, rooted in Fenrisian tribal traditions that predate the Imperium by millennia. The tribes of Fenris identify certain children as touched by the world spirit, youths who demonstrate unusual sensitivity to weather patterns, who experience prophetic dreams, or who seem to communicate with the great beasts that roam the death world's hostile environment. These children receive instruction from the tribe's existing shamans, learning to cast runes carved from the bones of Fenrisian predators, to read omens in the northern lights that dance across the polar skies, and to enter trance states that allow communion with what the Fenrisians understand as spirits of their world. When the Sky Warriors descend to select aspirants for transformation into Space Marines, those who have been marked as spirit-touched receive particular attention from the wolf priests who oversee recruitment. The gene seed implantation process affects rune priests differently than it does standard space wolves, or so the chapter maintains. The transformation amplifies their existing connection to Fenris strengthening abilities that were present in latent form before implantation began. A youth who could previously sense approaching storms might emerge from the transformation able to summon lightning with a gesture. One who experienced occasional prophetic dreams might develop reliable precognitive abilities that allow him to predict enemy movements in battle. The Space Wolves attribute these enhancements to the gene seed's interaction with the aspirant's spiritual connection to Fenris rather than to any awakening of psychic potential, though the practical result remains indistinguishable from what occurs when other chapters' aspirants manifest psychic abilities during transformation. Rune priests organize themselves according to Fenrisian tradition rather than the Codex Astartes structure that most chapters follow. They do not use titles like lexicanium or epistolary, instead employing ranks that reference their shamanic heritage. A junior rune priest might be called an initiate, while more experienced practitioners earn titles like Stormcaller or Rune Master. The most senior rune priests, those who have served for centuries and demonstrated both power and wisdom, might be honored as speakers of the dead, warriors who can commune with the spirits of fallen space wolves and draw upon their accumulated knowledge. Each great company includes at least one rune priest who serves as permanent member of that formation, advising the Wolf Lord and providing psychic support during operations. The rune priests maintain their own gatherings separate from the great companies, meeting in the Fang's deepest chambers to share knowledge and coordinate their efforts to protect the chapter from psychic threats. The specific techniques that rune priests employ reflect their cultural context, while achieving results similar to what librarians in other chapters accomplish through different methods. A rune priest preparing for battle might cast his runes, fragments of bone inscribed with symbols from Fenrisian mythology, and interpret the patterns they form to divine likely outcomes of the coming engagement. The process resembles the divination that other chapters' librarians practice through meditation or psychic perception, but the rune priest understands his actions as reading messages from Fenris itself, rather than as peering into the warp to perceive probability threads. When a rune priest summons lightning to strike down enemies, he believes he is calling upon the storm spirit of his homeworld, rather than channeling pyromantic energy through his own consciousness. The belief shapes how he experiences and controls his abilities, but the underlying psychic mechanisms remain consistent with what other Psykers employ. The Space Wolves' insistence on this distinction created significant tension at the Council of Nikaea and continues to generate friction with other chapters' librarians. The Thousand Suns before their fall viewed the rune priests as hypocrites who refused to acknowledge their own psychic nature, practicing the same arts they condemned in others, while hiding behind cultural justifications. Other chapters take more measured positions, recognizing that the Space Wolves' shamanic traditions provide effective frameworks for controlling and directing psychic power, even if the theoretical understanding differs from standard imperial doctrine. The practical cooperation between rune priests and librarians from other chapters generally proceeds smoothly during joint operations, as both groups recognize their common purpose in combating psychic threats regardless of disagreements about terminology or theory. The Blood Angels face psychic challenges unique among loyalist chapters, their librarians serving roles that extend far beyond standard battlefield support. The Red Thirst and the Black Rage represent genetic flaws inherited from Sanguinius himself, conditions that affect every son of the Ninth Legion to varying degrees. The Red Thirst manifests as an overwhelming hunger for blood, a vampiric craving that can drive affected Blood Angels into frenzies where they lose themselves to savage violence. The Black Rage proves even more devastating, a form of psychic madness where the afflicted warrior experiences visions of Sanguinius's final battle against Horus, his consciousness trapped in their Primarch's last moments as he fought and died aboard the vengeful spirit. Blood Angels who succumb to the Black Rage believe themselves to be Sanguinius, perceiving their battle brothers as the War Master's traitor forces and fighting with suicidal fury until death claims them. Blood Angels librarians serve as the chapter's primary defense against these genetic curses, using their psychic abilities to suppress the thirst and to delay the onset of the rage in battle brothers showing early symptoms. The techniques they employ require intimate knowledge of Blood Angels' physiology and the specific psychic mechanisms underlying their genetic flaws. A librarian monitoring his company for signs of the thirst extends his psychic senses throughout the formation, perceiving the subtle changes in his battle brother's psychic signatures that indicate the craving is growing stronger. He can project calming influences that help affected warriors maintain control, or in cases where a blood angel is on the verge of losing himself to the thirst, the librarian can impose psychic restraints that forcibly suppress the urge long enough for the warrior to regain his composure. The Black Rage presents challenges that even the most skilled librarians can only partially address. Once a blood angel begins experiencing the visions that characterize the rage, no psychic intervention can permanently reverse the process. The afflicted warrior's consciousness has become entangled with the psychic echo of Sanguinius's death, a trauma so profound that it imprinted itself upon the gene seed and continues to manifest in the Primarch's descendants 10,000 years later. What librarians can do is delay the final descent into complete madness, buying time for the chapter's chaplains to properly induct the afflicted warrior into the death company, rather than having him fall to the rage in the midst of battle where he might endanger his own squad. The librarian reaches into the affected warrior's mind, reinforcing his sense of self and his connection to his actual identity rather than the Primarch's memories that threaten to overwhelm him. The psychic communion that Blood Angels librarians maintain with the genetic memory of Sanguinius represents one of their most sacred and dangerous duties. Every son of the Ninth Legion carries within his gene seed fragments of their Primarch's consciousness, memories and experiences that have been passed down through generations of Blood Angels since Sanguinius's death. The librarians can access these memories more directly than other battle brothers, diving deep into the psychic resonance that connects all Blood Angels to their fallen Primarch. Through this communion, they experience Sanguinius's thoughts and emotions, gaining insights into his wisdom and his vision for the chapter. They perceive his final battle against Horus with terrible clarity, understanding the choices their Primarch made and the sacrifice he accepted to wound the War Master before the Emperor arrived. This communion carries profound risks beyond the obvious danger of succumbing to the Black Rage themselves. The memories they access are not simple recordings, but psychic impressions that carry emotional weight and spiritual significance. A librarian who communes too frequently or too deeply with Sanguinius's genetic memory risks losing his own identity, his personality subsumed by the overwhelming presence of the Primarch's consciousness. The chapter's chief librarian carefully regulates how often and under what circumstances librarians are permitted to engage in this communion, balancing the valuable insights it provides against the danger of losing experienced psychers to the very memories they study. Some Blood Angels librarians develop such strong connections to Sanguinius's memory that they begin experiencing his emotions and thoughts even when not actively seeking communion, their own consciousness gradually merging with the psychic echo of their Primarch. The monitoring duties that Blood Angels librarians perform extend to every aspect of chapter operations. During recruitment, they examine aspirants psychically to assess their susceptibility to the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, attempting to identify youths whose genetic makeup might prove more resistant to these afflictions. The screening remains imperfect. No test can predict with certainty which aspirants will resist the flaws and which will succumb, but it allows the chapter to make informed decisions about which candidates receive the gene seed. During training, librarians observe neophytes for early manifestations of the thirst or the rage, intervening when necessary to prevent young Blood Angels from harming themselves or their instructors. In combat, they maintain constant psychic vigilance over their battle brothers, ready to suppress outbreaks of the thirst or to identify warriors who have begun experiencing the visions that herald the Black Rage. The Death Company requires specialized psychic oversight that represents some of the Blood Angels Librarius's most challenging work. These warriors have succumbed fully to the Black Rage, their consciousness lost in Sanguinius's final moments, believing themselves to be their Primarch fighting aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The chaplains who lead the Death Company into battle provide spiritual guidance and tactical direction, but librarians must manage the psychic phenomena that accompany these doomed warriors. The visions that consume Death Company members generate psychic pressure that radiates outward, potentially triggering the rage in nearby Blood Angels who might otherwise resist it. A librarian assigned to operations involving the Death Company works to contain this psychic bleed-off, erecting barriers that prevent the madness from spreading while allowing the afflicted warriors to fight with the terrible fury that makes them so devastating in assault operations. The Dark Angels maintain their Librarius as part of the elaborate web of secrets and hidden knowledge that defines their chapter. Dark Angels Librarians occupy a unique position within the chapter's hierarchy, as many are inducted into the inner circle and thus granted knowledge of the fallen that remains hidden from ordinary battle brothers. This integration into the chapter's secret-keeping apparatus creates dual loyalties and responsibilities that librarians in other chapters do not face. A Dark Angels librarian must serve his company and his chapter master while also advancing the hunt for the fallen, using his psychic abilities to support both the chapter's public mission of defending the Imperium and its secret obsession with capturing every traitor who fled Caliban's destruction. The knowledge of the fallen that Inner Circle librarians possess shapes how they employ their abilities and what information they share with battle brothers who have not been inducted into the secret. A Dark Angels librarian using divination to predict enemy movements might perceive indications that one of the fallen operates in the region, but he cannot share this insight with his company captain unless that officer has also been inducted into the Inner Circle. The librarian must find ways to guide his chapter's forces toward confronting the fallen without revealing why this particular enemy deserves special attention. He might emphasize the strategic importance of a target that his divinations have revealed as connected to the fallen, or he might use his influence to ensure that Inner Circle members are positioned to respond when the traitor is located. The constant need to balance operational effectiveness with maintaining the chapter's secrets creates pressures that librarians in more straightforward chapters never experience. The cooperation between Dark Angels librarians and interrogator chaplains represents one of the chapter's most closely guarded operational procedures. When the Dark Angels capture one of the fallen, the process of breaking the traitor's will and extracting his confession requires both spiritual pressure from the interrogator chaplains and psychic intervention from the librarius. The interrogator chaplains work to convince the fallen of the error of their betrayal, using a combination of theological argument, psychological pressure, and when necessary, physical torture to break down the traitor's resistance. The librarians provide psychic support for this process, using their abilities to detect when the fallen is lying, to bypass mental conditioning that protects certain information, and to reinforce the psychological impact of the interrogator chaplain's efforts. The psychic interrogation techniques that Dark Angels librarians employ go beyond what most chapters would consider acceptable, refined through 10,000 years of obsessive focus on extracting confessions from the fallen. A Dark Angels librarian can invade a prisoner's mind with surgical precision, navigating through layers of memory and conditioning to locate specific information while leaving other mental structures intact. He can project psychic pain directly into the prisoner's consciousness, creating suffering that leaves no physical marks but proves no less effective than conventional torture. He can manipulate the prisoner's perception of time, making minutes feel like hours or days, accelerating the psychological breakdown that the interrogator chaplain works to achieve. These techniques exist at the edge of what the Imperium considers acceptable psychic practice, justified by the Dark Angels' conviction that capturing and redeeming the fallen represents their highest duty. The Ultramarines approach their Librarius with the same organizational rigor and scholarly emphasis that characterizes all aspects of their chapter. Ultramarines librarians receive training that stresses theoretical understanding alongside practical application, studying the mechanisms underlying psychic phenomena with the same thoroughness that the chapter applies to tactical doctrine or equipment maintenance. The Librarius maintains extensive archives documenting psychic threats the chapter has encountered, techniques that proved effective against specific enemy types, and ongoing research into improving psychic capabilities and defenses. An Ultramarines librarian is expected to contribute to these archives throughout his service, recording his experiences and insights so that future generations can benefit from his accumulated knowledge. The scholarly tradition within the Ultramarines Librarius creates warriors who understand not just how to employ their psychic abilities, but why specific techniques work, and what theoretical principles govern psychic phenomena. An Ultramarines librarian facing an unfamiliar psychic threat can draw upon his theoretical knowledge to develop countermeasures, even without specific prior experience with that particular enemy. He understands the fundamental rules governing how warp energy interacts with real space, how different psychic disciplines relate to each other, and what general principles apply across all psychic practice. This theoretical foundation proves particularly valuable when the chapter encounters Psykers, or chaos sorcerers employing techniques outside normal Imperial experience, as the Ultramarines librarian can analyze what he observes and formulate responses based on underlying principles rather than requiring specific training for every possible threat. The White Scars Stormseers maintain traditions that reflect their chapter's nomadic heritage and the warrior culture of Chogoris. Like the Space Wolves rune priests, Stormseers frame their abilities within cultural contexts that predate Imperial contact, though the White Scars show less insistence that their practices differ fundamentally from other chapters' psychic disciplines. A Stormseer understands himself as channeling the fury of Chogoris's endless plains and violent weather, but he acknowledges that this represents a cultural interpretation of psychic power rather than a distinct source separate from the warp. The Stormseers incorporate their homeworld shamanic practices into their training, learning to read omens in weather patterns and animal behavior, but they also study standard Imperial psychic theory and maintain regular communication with librarians from other chapters. The combat doctrine that Stormseers support emphasizes mobility and sudden overwhelming force, matching the White Scars' preference for lightning strikes and rapid redeployment. A Stormseer attached to a White Scars bike squad uses his abilities to enhance the formation's speed and striking power, employing biomancy to push both his own capabilities and those of his battle brothers beyond normal limits. He might use divination to identify optimal attack vectors or to predict when enemy forces will be most vulnerable to assault. The Stormseers prove particularly skilled at maintaining psychic coordination across fast-moving formations spread across wide areas, their abilities allowing White Scars forces to operate with cohesion despite the distances that separate individual units during their sweeping maneuvers. The Salamanders integrate their librarians into the chapter's emphasis on craftsmanship and forge work, developing psychic techniques that complement their cultural focus on creation and protection. Salamanders librarians learn meditation practices centered on the forge, entering trance states while working heated metal or tending the volcanic forges that dot Nocturne's surface. These forge meditation techniques serve dual purposes, providing both the mental discipline necessary for safe psychic practice and deepening the librarian's connection to his chapter's cultural identity. A Salamander's librarian might spend hours at the forge between battles, the repetitive physical work and the heat of the flames creating conditions conducive to psychic development and mental clarity. The combat applications of Salamander's psychic abilities tend toward protection and support rather than pure offense, though their librarians prove no less deadly than those from other chapters when circumstances require direct psychic assault. A Salamander's librarian fighting alongside his battle brothers focuses on maintaining defensive barriers that protect the formation, using biomancy to heal wounded warriors so they can continue fighting, or employing pyromancy in ways that create zones of fire that channel enemy movement rather than simply immolating targets. The approach reflects the Salamander's broader tactical philosophy, emphasizing endurance and the protection of Imperial citizens, their librarians serving as anchors around which defensive positions can be established and held against overwhelming enemy numbers. The Black Templars represent the extreme opposite of chapters that embrace their librarians, maintaining an absolute rejection of Psykers within their ranks that dates to their founding. When the Imperial fists were divided during the Second Founding, Sigismund led those warriors who would become the Black Templars away from their parent chapter, taking with them a deep suspicion of psychic power that has only intensified across the millennia. The Black Templars maintain that faith in the Emperor provides all the protection and guidance their crusades require, that reliance on Psykers represents weakness and invites the very corruption that psychic abilities supposedly help combat. They point to the fall of the Thousand Suns and the countless incidents of librarians succumbing to possession as evidence that no amount of training or discipline can eliminate the fundamental danger inherent in touching the warp. The chapter's rejection of librarians extends beyond simply choosing not to recruit or train psykers. The Black Templars actively suppress any psychic abilities that manifest among their neophytes, viewing such manifestations as taints to be purged rather than gifts to be cultivated. A Black Templar's aspirant who demonstrates psychic potential during or after gene seed implantation faces immediate termination in most cases, the chapter unwilling to risk corruption by allowing a psyker to remain among their ranks even if he shows perfect control over his abilities. In rare instances where the manifestation occurs in a neophyte who has already proven himself exceptionally valuable, or where the abilities remain minor enough to potentially suppress through faith and discipline, the chapter's chaplains might attempt to help the affected warrior contain his powers through prayer and devotion rather than psychic training. These attempts succeed rarely, and even when they do, the warrior remains under permanent suspicion and constant observation. The Black Templars' crusades operate without psychic support that other chapters take for granted, forcing them to develop alternative methods for dealing with threats that librarians would normally address. When facing enemy psykers or demonic entities, the Black Templars rely on overwhelming force, faith-based resistance to psychic attack, and specialized equipment like null field generators that create zones of psychic suppression. Their chaplains lead prayers and benedictions that the chapter believes provide genuine protection against warp-based threats, creating shields of faith that substitute for the psychic barriers a librarian might erect. The effectiveness of these faith-based defenses remains difficult to assess objectively, as the Black Templars attribute their survival and success to the Emperor's direct intervention, while outside observers might suggest that their tactics simply prove adequate despite the absence of psychic support, rather than because faith provides supernatural protection. The history of the Adeptus Astartes includes librarians whose deeds have shaped the Imperium's understanding of psychic warfare, and whose names carry weight across entire segmentums. These warriors represent the pinnacle of what a Space Marine Psyker can achieve, combining centuries of combat experience with psychic power that rivals the mightiest servants of the Emperor. Their stories serve as examples for younger librarians, demonstrating both the heights of capability that disciplined psychic practice can reach and the constant vigilance required to maintain that discipline against the corrupting influence of the warp. Varro Tigurius stands as the chief librarian of the Ultramarines, a position he has held for over 2 centuries through a combination of exceptional psychic ability and the strategic insight that characterizes his chapter. His elevation to chief librarian came after the previous holder of that office fell in battle against a Tyranid hive fleet, leaving the Ultramarines Librarius in need of leadership during one of the chapter's most challenging periods. Tigurius assumed command and immediately demonstrated why the chapter master had selected him for the role, coordinating the psychic defenses that helped turn back the Tyranid invasion and establishing protocols for combating the hive mind's psychic influence that other chapters would later adopt when facing their own encounters with the Great Devourer. The psychic capabilities that Tigurius commands exceed those of most chief librarians, placing him among the most powerful human psykers in the Imperium, outside the Inquisition's most exceptional operatives. His mastery of divination proves particularly remarkable, his precognitive abilities allowing him to perceive probable futures with clarity that approaches certainty. During the defense of Crag against Hive Fleet Behemoth, Tigurius provided warnings that allowed Marnius Calgar to position Ultramarines' forces to intercept Tyranid advances before they could overwhelm critical positions. His predictions guided the chapter's counterattacks, identifying moments when Tyranid bioforms would be vulnerable to assault or when enemy reinforcements would arrive at contested locations. The accuracy of his divinations proved so consistent that Calgar integrated Tigurius's predictions directly into his tactical planning, treating the chief librarian's visions as reliable intelligence rather than uncertain possibilities. The techniques Tigurius employs to achieve this level of divinatory precision remain subjects of study within the Ultramarines Librarius and among allied chapters who have observed him in action. He enters meditative states that can last for hours, his consciousness ranging across the web of probability threads that extend from each present moment. Unlike many diviners who perceive only symbolic or metaphorical visions requiring interpretation, Tigurius experiences future events with sensory clarity that includes tactical details useful for military planning. He perceives the exact positions where enemy forces will deploy, the specific weapons they will employ, and the timing of their attacks with accuracy measured in minutes rather than hours or days. This precision comes at significant cost. Extended divination sessions leave him physically exhausted despite his enhanced Space Marine physiology, and the constant exposure to future possibilities creates psychological strain that would break lesser Psykers. The strategic value that Tigurius provides to the Ultramarines extends beyond his personal combat capabilities or his role in individual battles. His position as keeper of the chapter's historical records gives him access to 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge, which he combines with his divinatory abilities to identify patterns and trends that might otherwise go unnoticed. He has predicted the emergence of Wa movements months before Orc forces began consolidating, allowing the Ultramarines to position strike forces to intercept the Greenskins before they could achieve critical mass. His analysis of chaos cult activity across Ultramar has identified corruption networks that the Inquisition had failed to detect, enabling preemptive strikes that prevented demonic incursions. The chapter master relies on Tigurius not just as a powerful psyker, but as a strategic advisor whose insights shape Ultramarines' operations across multiple sectors. The psychic hood that Tigurius wears represents one of the finest examples of such equipment in the Imperium, incorporating archaeotech components recovered from a space hulk during the chapter's early history. The device enhances his already formidable abilities while providing protection against psychic attack that has saved his life on multiple occasions. During an engagement against word-bearer sorcerers, Tigurius weathered psychic assaults that would have killed ordinary librarians, his hood's protective matrices dissipating the hostile energies before they could reach his consciousness. The Tech Marines who maintain the hood understand its function only partially, able to repair damage and replace worn components, but unable to replicate the archaeotech elements that provide its most sophisticated capabilities. Mephiston, Lord of Death, stands apart from every other librarian in the Imperium as a warrior who overcame the Black Rage through sheer force of will and emerged transformed into something beyond a normal Space Marine. His story begins as Calistarius, a Blood Angels librarian serving with distinction during the defense of Hades' Hive against Hive Fleet Leviathan. The psychic pressure generated by the Tyrannid hive mind, combined with the intense combat and the constant presence of death, triggered the Black Rage in Calistarius despite his psychic training and mental disciplines. He fell into the visions that consume all who succumb to the flaw, experiencing Sanguinius's final battle as if he were the Primarch himself, his consciousness lost in the memory of fighting Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The Blood Angels inducted Calistarius into the Death Company, expecting him to die in battle, as all who fall to the Rage eventually do. They equipped him with the black armor and the death masks that marked those doomed warriors, assigned him to the Death Company's next assault, and prepared to honor his memory after his inevitable death. During the battle that followed, something unprecedented occurred. Calistarius, fighting in the grip of the Rage with the fury of a warrior who believed himself to be Sanguinius facing the Warmaster, somehow retained enough of his own consciousness to recognize what was happening to him. Through psychic power amplified by desperation and the enhanced capabilities that the Rage provided, he fought against the visions consuming his mind. The struggle occurred on levels beyond the physical battle raging around him, his consciousness warring with the genetic memory of his Primarch's death, while his body continued fighting Tyrannids with mechanical precision. The transformation that occurred when Calistarius emerged from this internal battle left him fundamentally changed. He retained his identity and his sanity, but the experience of passing through the Black Rage and returning had altered him at a level that even the Blood Angels' sanguinary priests and librarians struggle to fully understand. His psychic abilities increased dramatically, his power now exceeding what he had possessed before the rage took him. His physical capabilities surpassed even the enhanced baseline of a Space Marine, his strength and speed approaching levels that should be impossible for an Astartes to achieve without biomantic enhancement. He took the name Mephiston, abandoning his former identity to mark the transformation he had undergone, and assumed the title Lord of Death to acknowledge what he had become. The Blood Angels chapter regards Mephiston with a mixture of reverence and unease. He represents hope that the Black Rage might not be absolutely inevitable, that warriors who fall to it might somehow return from the madness that has claimed so many of their brothers. Yet he also represents something unknown and potentially dangerous, a warrior who has passed through an experience that should be fatal and emerged with capabilities that no Space Marine should possess. The chapter's chaplains and librarians monitor him constantly, watching for any sign that the rage might return or that his transformation conceals corruption of a different sort. Mephiston himself maintains that he conquered the rage through will and faith, that his transformation represents triumph over the flaw rather than submission to it, but he acknowledges that he cannot fully explain what occurred during those moments when his consciousness fought against Sanguinius's genetic memory. The combat capabilities that Mephiston demonstrates in battle exceed those of chief librarians from other chapters, despite his official rank within the Blood Angels Librarius. He wields psychic power with precision that suggests centuries more experience than his actual age would indicate, as if passing through the Black Rage somehow granted him access to knowledge or capabilities that normal training cannot provide. His biomantic abilities allow him to enhance his already superhuman physical characteristics to levels that let him engage enemies that would challenge entire squads of Space Marines. During the Cryptus campaign against Hive Fleet Leviathan, Mephiston fought a Hive tyrant in single combat, his psychically enhanced strength allowing him to tear through the creature's carapace, while his precognitive abilities let him avoid its strikes. The duel ended with the Hive tyrant's death, and Mephiston standing victorious despite wounds that would have incapacitated lesser warriors. The psychological isolation that Mephiston experiences as the only Space Marine to have returned from the Black Rage creates barriers between him and his battle brothers that even centuries of continued service cannot fully overcome. Warriors who fought alongside him before his fall to the Rage struggle to reconcile their memories of Callisterius with the transformed being who returned. Death Company members who knew him during his brief time among their ranks before his emergence cannot comprehend how he escaped the fate they all face. Even other librarians within the Blood Angels find Mephiston difficult to relate to, as his experience and his capabilities place him in a category beyond normal librarian progression. He serves the chapter with absolute dedication, leading assaults against the Blood Angels' most dangerous enemies, and providing psychic support that has proven decisive in numerous engagements, yet he remains fundamentally alone in ways that extend beyond the normal isolation that all librarians experience. Ezekiel holds the position of Grand Master of Librarians within the Dark Angels, making him one of the most senior members of the Inner Circle, and privy to secrets that the chapter guards more jealously than any other loyalist force. His elevation to Grand Master came after his predecessor fell during an operation against one of the Fallen, leaving the position vacant at a time when the chapter's hunt for the traitors from Caliban had intensified following new intelligence about their locations. Ezekiel assumed command of the Librarius and immediately demonstrated the combination of psychic power and absolute commitment to the chapter's secret mission that the position requires. He coordinates the psychic resources that support the hunt for the Fallen, maintains the mental defenses that protect the chapter's secrets from external psychic probing, and serves as Supreme Grand Master Azrael's closest advisor on matters involving both psychic threats and the ongoing pursuit of the traitors. The Book of Salvation that Ezekiel keeps represents one of the Dark Angel's most sacred and closely guarded artifacts, a tome containing the names of every known fallen and records of the chapter's efforts to capture or kill them across 10 millennia. The book exists as much in the psychic realm as in physical reality, its pages inscribed with text that only those inducted into the inner circle can read, and that burns the eyes of anyone else who attempts to view it. Ezekiel maintains the book personally, adding new names as the Dark Angels identify additional fallen and recording the circumstances of each traitor's capture or death. The psychic protections woven into the book's structure prevent it from being destroyed through normal means and ensure that if it falls into enemy hands, the information it contains will remain inaccessible to those who lack the proper psychic keys to unlock it. The interrogation techniques that Ezekiel has refined through centuries of working with the chapter's interrogator chaplains represent some of the most sophisticated psychic manipulation in the Imperium. When the Dark Angels capture one of the fallen, Ezekiel participates directly in the process of breaking the traitor's will and extracting his confession. He uses telepathy to bypass mental conditioning that protects information about other fallen, biomancy to sustain prisoners through interrogation sessions that would kill normal humans through shock or blood loss, and divination to identify which psychological pressures will prove most effective against specific individuals. The combination of psychic assault and the interrogator chaplain's spiritual pressure creates conditions where even the most resistant fallen eventually break, providing the names and locations of their fellow traitors before finally accepting redemption through death. The psychic defenses that Ezekiel maintains around the rock, the Dark Angels' fortress monastery, extend far beyond normal chapter protective wards. He has woven barriers that prevent external Psykers from detecting the presence of captured fallen held in the deepest dungeons, that shield the inner circle's communications from psychic eavesdropping, and that alert him immediately if anyone attempts to probe the chapter's secrets through psychic means. These defenses require constant maintenance and periodic renewal, consuming significant amounts of Ezekiel's time and energy, even when the chapter is not actively engaged in operations. The wards incorporate techniques that the Dark Angels have preserved since the Great Crusade, knowledge that even other first founding chapters no longer possess, making the rock one of the most psychically secure locations in the Imperium outside Terra itself. Ozek Ahriman stands as the most infamous example of a librarian's fall to corruption, though his story begins in service to the Imperium during the Great Crusade. As chief librarian of the Thousand Sons before the heresy, Ahriman represented everything that Magnus the Red believed the Librarius could achieve, a warrior who combined exceptional psychic power with scholarly dedication to understanding the warp's nature and developing techniques for safe psychic practice. He argued passionately at the Council of Nikaea for the continued use of librarians, presenting evidence of the Thousand Sons' achievements and the sophisticated training protocols that allowed them to wield power that would destroy less disciplined Psykers. His failure to convince the Emperor and the subsequent edict banning librarians represented a personal defeat that contributed to the bitterness many Thousand Sons felt toward what they viewed as the Imperium's rejection of knowledge and progress. The burning of Prospero and the Thousand Sons' subsequent flight to the planet of the Sorcerers within the Eye of Terror transformed Ahriman from a loyal servant of the Imperium into a sorcerer serving Tzeentch, though he maintains to this day that his actions serve the pursuit of knowledge rather than the Chaos God's agenda. The flesh change that plagued the Thousand Sons after their corruption, turning warriors into mindless spawn as their bodies mutated uncontrollably, drove Ahriman to desperate measures. He developed the rubric that bears his name, a sorcerous ritual intended to halt the flesh change by binding his battle brothers' souls into their armor, preserving their consciousness even as their physical bodies were reduced to dust. The rubric succeeded in stopping the mutations, but at catastrophic cost. Most Thousand Sons became animated suits of armor containing only dust, their souls trapped but their minds destroyed, capable of following orders but possessing no independent thought or personality. The consequences of the rubric earned Ahriman banishment from the Thousand Sons by Magnus himself, though the Crimson King's anger could not undo what had been done. Ahriman has spent the millennia since wandering the Eye of Terror and raiding into real space, gathering followers, and pursuing his obsessive quest for knowledge that he believes will somehow reverse the rubric's effects and restore his battle brothers. His psychic capabilities have grown to rival those of the greatest sorcerers in the service of chaos, his mastery of the warp's mechanisms exceeding what any loyal librarian could safely attempt. He commands sorcerous powers that can reshape reality, summon legions of demons, or strike down entire companies of space marines with psychic lightning. The Black Library of the Eldar represents his ultimate goal, as he believes the knowledge contained within that repository could provide the understanding necessary to undo what the rubric did to his legion. Lork of the World Eaters holds the unfortunate distinction of being the first librarian to die as a direct result of the Edict of Nikaea's enforcement. As one of the 12th Legion's few Psykers, Lork had served throughout the Great Crusade despite his Primarch's general disdain for psychic abilities. Angron viewed all Psykers with suspicion, considering them weak warriors who relied on sorcery rather than honest combat, but he tolerated Lork's presence because the librarian's abilities proved useful in specific situations. The Edict of Nikaea provided Angron with justification to purge the few Psykers remaining in his legion, and he moved to enforce the prohibition with characteristic brutality. Lork died during the initial enforcement actions, killed by his own battle brothers on Angron's orders, as the World Eaters eliminated every warrior who had served in their librarius. The manner of Lork's death and the circumstances surrounding it remain subjects of debate among Imperial historians who study the period immediately following Nikaea. Some accounts suggest that Lork resisted the order to disband the librarius, and that his death resulted from combat with World Eaters sent to enforce compliance. Others maintain that Angron ordered the execution of all former librarians regardless of whether they accepted the edict, viewing the prohibition as an opportunity to rid his legion of warriors he had never wanted in the first place. The truth likely lies somewhere between these versions, with Lork's death representing both Angron's particular hostility towards Psykers and the broader violence that accompanied the edict's enforcement in legions where primarchs or commanders held strong anti-Psyker sentiments. The legacy that these notable librarians leave extends beyond their individual achievements or failures. Tigurius demonstrates what disciplined psychic practice combined with strategic insight can accomplish, his service to the Ultramarines proving the value that librarians provide to their chapters. Mephiston represents both hope and warning, hope that even the Blood Angel's genetic curse might be overcome through will and faith, warning that such transformation comes at costs that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. Ezekiel exemplifies the dual nature of Dark Angel's librarians, serving both as psychic warriors and as keepers of secrets that define their chapter's identity and mission. Ahriman stands as the ultimate cautionary tale, a librarian whose power and knowledge led not to enlightenment, but to damnation and the destruction of everything he sought to protect. Lork's death reminds all librarians that their position within the Adeptus Astartes remains contingent on continued acceptance by their chapters and the Imperium, that the powers they wield mark them as both valuable assets and potential threats requiring constant vigilance. The Thousand Sons represent the ultimate perversion of everything the Librarius was meant to be, a legion of Psykers who abandon the disciplines and safeguards that protect loyal Space Marines from corruption in exchange for power that no servant of the Emperor could safely wield. Where a chapter's Librarius maintains strict protocols governing psychic practice, the Thousand Sons embrace techniques that would see any loyal librarian executed for heresy. Where librarians construct mental barriers to protect themselves from demonic influence, the sorcerers of the 15th Legion deliberately tear down those barriers to channel energies drawn directly from Tzeentch. The transformation from disciplined Psykers to chaos sorcerers did not occur overnight, but through gradual erosion of the principles that Magnus the Red had established during the Great Crusade, each compromise leading to greater corruption, until the Legion found itself irrevocably bound to the Architect of Fate. The burning of Prospero initiated the Thousand Sons' descent into full sorcery, though the seeds of their corruption had been planted long before the Space Wolves arrived in orbit above their homeworld. Magnus had delved too deeply into forbidden knowledge, convinced that his understanding and power made him immune to the dangers that consumed lesser Psykers. The Primarch's arrogance blinded him to the trap being set, and when the space wolves attacked, he saw no alternative but to accept the bargain Tzeentch offered. The Legion's transportation to the planet of the sorcerers within the Eye of Terror completed their physical corruption, but their spiritual damnation had begun the moment Magnus decided that some knowledge was worth any price to obtain. The sorcerers who survived Prospero found themselves in a realm where the warp's energies flowed without the constraints that reality normally imposed, where their abilities could grow exponentially, but at the cost of their souls. The rubric of Ahriman transformed the Thousand Sons from a legion of sorcerers into something even more horrifying. Ahriman's attempt to halt the flesh change, afflicting his battle brothers, succeeded in stopping the mutations, but reduced most Thousand Sons to animated suits of armor containing nothing but dust. The sorcerers who retained their consciousness and bodies after the rubric became the Legion's elite, warriors whose psychic capabilities had survived the ritual intact, and who now commanded powers that dwarfed what they had possessed before their corruption. These sorcerers learned to summon demons of Tzeentch with gestures, to reshape reality through elaborate rituals, and to perceive futures with clarity that approached genuine omniscience within limited scopes. The price they paid involved binding their souls to the Changer of Ways in ways that made redemption impossible even if they desired it. The combat doctrine that Thousand Sons sorcerers employ bears superficial resemblance to how loyal librarians operate, but diverges fundamentally in execution and underlying philosophy. A Thousand Sons sorcerer approaching battle does not carefully measure his psychic exertion to avoid perils or maintain mental defenses against corruption. He channels power with reckless abandon, drawing upon Tzeentch's essence to fuel abilities that would kill a loyal librarian attempting the same feats. The sorcerer might summon a Lord of Change to the battlefield, the greater demon manifesting through a ritual that takes mere minutes rather than the hours or days such summonings would normally require. He might project psychic fire that burns with colors that do not exist in normal reality, flames that consume not just physical matter, but the souls of those they touch. The techniques work because the sorcerer has abandoned any pretense of controlling the warp, instead allowing it to flow through him as a willing conduit for Tzeentch's power. The organizational structure of Thousand Sons warbands reflects their transformation into full servants of chaos. They do not maintain a librarius in any recognizable form, but instead organize themselves into cabals led by the most powerful sorcerers, with the rubric Marines serving as mindless automatons that follow their master's commands without question or independent thought. A sorcerer leading a cabal might command dozens or even hundreds of rubric Marines, directing them through psychic impulses that the dust-filled armor responds to with mechanical precision. The sorcerers themselves compete for power and knowledge, forming temporary alliances when their goals align, but betraying each other without hesitation when opportunities arise to advance their individual agendas. Tzeentch encourages this constant scheming and backstabbing, viewing it as natural expression of change and ambition. The specific techniques that Thousand Sons sorcerers employ demonstrate capabilities that loyal librarians cannot replicate without damning themselves. A sorcerer might use biomancy not to heal or enhance, but to transform enemies into chaos spawn, their bodies warping into impossible configurations as the warp reshapes their flesh according to the sorcerer's will. Pyromantic abilities become tools for summoning warp fire that burns through both material and immaterial defenses, consuming souls as readily as bodies. Divination extends beyond perceiving probable futures to actually manipulating probability itself, the sorcerer reaching into the web of causality to ensure that specific outcomes occur regardless of what actions others take to prevent them. These applications require drawing upon demonic power that no loyal Psyker would dare channel, accepting corruption as the necessary price for capabilities that transcend what disciplined psychic practice can achieve. The threat that Thousand Sons sorcerers represent to Imperial forces extends beyond their personal combat capabilities. A single sorcerer leading a warband can corrupt entire planetary populations through psychic manipulation, implanting thoughts and desires that lead citizens to embrace chaos worship without realizing they have been influenced. The sorcerer might establish cult networks that operate for decades before revealing themselves, their members believing they act from their own convictions, rather than recognizing the psychic conditioning that shaped those convictions. When the cults finally rise up, the sorcerer can channel their collective psychic energy to fuel rituals that tear open warp rifts or summon demon legions, turning loyal imperial worlds into nightmare realms where reality itself becomes mutable. The word-bearers produce sorcerers who serve chaos undivided rather than pledging themselves to any single ruinous power, their abilities drawing upon all four chaos gods simultaneously. The 17th Legion's fall to chaos began long before the heresy erupted openly, with Lorgar Aurelian leading his warriors into worship of the ruinous powers after the Emperor's censure at Monarchia. The word-bearers who had served as librarians before the Legion's corruption became Dark Apostles, combining their psychic abilities with religious fervor to create warrior priests who preach the divinity of chaos while demonstrating its power through sorcerous acts. These Dark Apostles view themselves as missionaries bringing enlightenment to a galaxy that refuses to acknowledge the truth of the warp's supremacy, their corruption so complete that they genuinely believe they serve a righteous cause. The rituals that word-bearers sorcerers perform require components and sacrifices that make even other chaos worshippers uncomfortable. A Dark Apostle preparing to summon a greater demon might spend weeks gathering the necessary materials, blood from specific victim types, bones carved with blasphemous inscriptions, artifacts stolen from imperial temples, and desecrated through elaborate ceremonies. The ritual itself involves chanting in languages that predate humanity, the words carrying psychic weight that causes reality to thin in the ritual space. Sacrifices die screaming as their life force fuels the summoning, their souls offered to the chaos gods as payment for the demon's manifestation. The Dark Apostle conducting the ritual maintains absolute focus throughout, his consciousness spread across multiple levels of reality simultaneously as he negotiates with demonic entities and shapes the warp energies flowing through the ritual space. The combat applications of word-bearers sorcery emphasize corruption and conversion rather than simple destruction. A Dark Apostle facing Imperial Guard regiments might use telepathy to project visions of the Chaos Gods' glory directly into the soldiers' minds, showing them futures where they embrace chaos worship and receive rewards beyond anything the Imperium could offer. The technique proves devastatingly effective against troops whose faith in the Emperor lacks the absolute conviction necessary to resist such temptation. Entire companies have turned traitor after exposure to word-bearers' psychic manipulation, their loyalty eroded by visions that exploit their doubts and fears. The Dark Apostles view these conversions as their greatest victories, proof that chaos represents truth while the Imperial Creed offers only lies and false promises. The Death Guard maintain fewer sorcerers than other traitor legions, as Mortarian's hatred of Psykers survived his fall to chaos and continues to shape his legion's culture even after their transformation into servants of Nurgle. The sorcerers who do serve the 14th Legion typically came from other forces or represent Death Guard who developed psychic abilities after their corruption, their powers emerging as gifts from the Plague God rather than through any training or discipline. These plague sorcerers wield biomancy twisted into tools for spreading disease and decay, their abilities allowing them to accelerate rot, to summon clouds of infectious flies, or to cause enemies' bodies to bloat and burst as virulent plagues consume them from within. The sorcery they practice bears little resemblance to the disciplined techniques that loyal librarians employ, instead manifesting as expressions of Nurgle's essence channeled through willing hosts. The Black Legion and other warbands that draw recruits from multiple sources include sorcerers who bring techniques and traditions from their original legions, creating diverse approaches to chaos sorcery that reflect the fragmented nature of the traitor forces. A Black Legion warband might include a former Thousand Suns sorcerer who maintains his legion's scholarly approach to the warp, a word-bearer's Dark Apostle who view sorcery through religious frameworks, and renegades from loyalist chapters who fell to corruption and learned sorcerous techniques from demonic tutors. These sorcerers compete for influence within the warband, while cooperating when necessary to achieve objectives that serve their collective interests. The Warmaster who commands the Black Legion encourages this competition, believing it keeps his sorcerers sharp and prevents any single Psyker from accumulating enough power to challenge his authority. The Eldar represent the most sophisticated psychic threat that librarians regularly encounter, a race whose entire civilization revolves around psychic capability and whose understanding of the warp exceeds anything humanity has achieved. Every Eldar possesses some degree of psychic sensitivity, their souls burning brighter in the warp than human souls, and their connection to the Immaterium forming an integral part of their existence. The Farseers who guide craftworld policies and the Warlocks who lead aspect warrior shrines demonstrate psychic capabilities that rival the most powerful human Psykers, their abilities refined through centuries of training within psychic disciplines that predate humanity's emergence as a spacefaring species. When Librarians face Eldar Psykers in combat, they confront enemies whose mastery of psychic warfare makes most human techniques appear crude by comparison. Eldar Farseers employ divination as their primary discipline, perceiving futures with clarity and precision that human diviners cannot match. A Farseer examining the threads of probability that extend from the present moment sees not vague symbolic visions, but detailed images of specific outcomes, complete with tactical information about enemy positions, weather conditions, and the consequences of different courses of action. The Farseer uses this information to guide Eldar forces with supernatural precision, positioning units to intercept enemies before they arrive, concentrating fire on targets whose destruction will create cascading failures in enemy plans, and avoiding ambushes that would catch forces lacking such prescient guidance. The accuracy of Farseer predictions makes them extraordinarily difficult opponents, as they seem to anticipate every tactic their enemies employ and position appropriate counters before those tactics can be executed. The runes that Farseers cast serve as focusing tools that help them navigate the overwhelming complexity of future possibilities without losing themselves in the infinite branches of causality. Each rune represents specific concepts or forces, and the patterns they form when cast provide frameworks for interpreting the visions that the Farseer experiences. A human observer watching a Farseer cast runes might see nothing but an Eldar manipulating carved stones, but psychically sensitive witnesses perceive the enormous energies flowing through the ritual as the Farseer's consciousness ranges across time and space. The technique allows Farseers to maintain coherent focus despite perceiving multiple timelines simultaneously, compartmentalizing different probability threads so they can analyze each without becoming paralyzed by the sheer volume of information. Eldar Warlocks combine psychic ability with close combat prowess, serving as warrior-psykers who lead aspect warrior shrines into battle. Where Farseers focus primarily on divination and strategic guidance, Warlocks employ their abilities more directly in combat, using psychic power to enhance their own capabilities and to strike down enemies with techniques that blend physical and psychic assault. A Warlock charging into melee might use biomancy to increase his speed beyond what even Eldar physiology normally allows, becoming a blur that human eyes cannot track as he moves between targets. He projects psychic force through his Witchblade, the weapon serving as a focus that channels his power into strikes that bypass armor to destroy the target's soul directly. The combination of Eldar martial skill and psychic enhancement makes Warlocks extraordinarily dangerous opponents in close combat, capable of cutting through Space Marine squads with contemptuous ease. The psychic techniques that Eldar employ differ fundamentally from human psychic practice in ways that reflect the different relationships their species have with the warp. Eldar Psykers do not draw power from the Immaterium in the same manner that human Psykers do, instead channeling energy through the infinity circuits built into their craftworlds, or through psychic constructs called Wraithbone that shapes warp energy into stable forms. This approach provides protection against demonic corruption that human Psykers lack, as the Eldar never create direct connections between their souls and the raw warp. The technique requires infrastructure and preparation that humans cannot replicate, making it unsuitable for adoption by Imperial forces, even if the Eldar were willing to share their knowledge. Orc weirdboys represent psychic threats of an entirely different nature, Psykers whose abilities manifest through mechanisms that human Psykers find almost incomprehensible. Orc psychic power derives from the Gestalt psychic field that all greenskins generate collectively, a phenomenon called the Wa that grows stronger as more orcs gather in proximity. Weirdboys serve as focal points for this psychic energy, their brains structured in ways that allow them to channel the Wa's power into devastating psychic attacks. The process proves intensely painful for the weirdboy, as the energy flowing through his nervous system exceeds what his physiology can comfortably handle. Weirdboys describe the sensation as having their heads filled with pressure that builds until it must be released through psychic discharge, or the weirdboy's skull literally explodes from the accumulated energy. The psychic attacks that weirdboys unleash lack the precision and control that human or Eldar Psykers achieve, but compensate through sheer, overwhelming power. A weirdboy releasing accumulated Wa energy might project a blast of psychic force that vaporizes everything in a cone extending dozens of meters from his position, the attack powered by the collective psychic output of hundreds or thousands of orcs in the surrounding area. The weirdboy exercises minimal control over these discharges beyond choosing the general direction, the energy finding its own path to targets, and often causing collateral damage to nearby orcs who happen to be in the blast radius. Orc mobs accept this as normal, viewing weirdboy casualties among their own ranks as acceptable prices for the destruction the psychic attacks inflict on enemies. Librarians combating weirdboys face challenges different from those presented by human or Eldar Psykers. The weirdboy's psychic signature appears alien and chaotic, lacking the structured patterns that human psychic activity generates. Attempting to predict what a weirdboy will do next through divination proves unreliable, as the orc's actions depend partly on conscious decisions, but largely on how much Wa energy has accumulated in his vicinity, and when that energy reaches levels requiring discharge. Telepathic attacks against weirdboys encounter minds so fundamentally different from human consciousness that establishing meaningful contact proves difficult, and even when contact succeeds, the orc's primitive nervous system resists psychic manipulation that would incapacitate human targets. The most effective approach involves either killing the weirdboy before he can release accumulated energy, or disrupting the Wa field that powers him by eliminating enough of the surrounding orcs to reduce the psychic pressure to manageable levels. The Tyranid hive mind represents a psychic threat that operates on scales incomprehensible to individual consciousness, a gestalt intelligence formed from billions of organisms connected through synaptic links that span light years. The hive mind does not think in ways that human or even Eldar minds can fully comprehend, its consciousness distributed across entire hive fleets with no single point of failure or central location that could be targeted. Librarians attempting to perceive the hive mind through psychic senses describe the experience as overwhelming, like trying to understand an ocean by examining individual water molecules. The psychic pressure that the hive mind generates creates what Imperial forces call the shadow in the warp, a phenomenon that disrupts normal psychic activity and makes warp travel extremely dangerous in regions where Tyranid hive fleets operate. The synapse creatures that serve as the hive mind's primary control nodes within Tyranid swarms represent the most immediate psychic threat that librarians face when combating the Great Devourer. These organisms, hive tyrants, Tyranid warriors, and various specialized bioforms, maintain psychic connections to the lesser Tyranid creatures in their vicinity, coordinating swarm behavior and ensuring that even simple organisms execute complex tactical maneuvers. A synapse creature directs its swarm through psychic impulses that bypass conscious thought, each organism receiving instructions that it follows with perfect obedience. Eliminating synapse creatures disrupts this coordination, causing lesser Tyranids to revert to instinctive behavior that makes them far less dangerous than when operating under hive mind control. Librarians targeting synapse creatures must overcome psychic defenses that differ fundamentally from anything human or Psykers employ. The synapse creature's consciousness represents only a tiny fragment of the hive mind's totality, with the vast majority of its intelligence existing elsewhere within the psychic network. Telepathic attacks that would destroy a human Psyker's mind barely register to a synapse creature, as the damage affects only the local node, while the greater hive mind remains intact. Psychic assaults must either sever the synapse creature's connection to the hive mind entirely or overwhelm the local node with such force that the creature's physical form dies before the hive mind can compensate. Both approaches require enormous psychic power and expose the attacking librarian to the full weight of the hive mind's attention, as the Gestalt intelligence recognizes threats to its control nodes and responds with psychic pressure designed to crush the attacker's consciousness. The Necrons present psychic challenges of an entirely different sort, as their technology operates on principles that actively nullify psychic phenomena. The ancient Xenos race abandoned biological existence millions of years ago, transferring their consciousness into mechanical bodies that possess no souls and generate no presence in the warp. Necron technology incorporates principles that create zones of psychic nullification, areas where the warp cannot influence reality, and where Psykers find their abilities suppressed or completely negated. Librarians operating in proximity to Necron forces experience their connection to the warp weakening, their psychic senses becoming muffled, as if trying to perceive through thick barriers, and their abilities failing or producing unpredictable results when they attempt to channel power. The Necron pylons represent the most extreme manifestation of their anti-psychic technology, massive structures that generate fields capable of suppressing psychic activity across entire regions. When pylons activate, Psykers within their area of effect find themselves cut off from the warp entirely, their abilities rendered completely useless regardless of their power level or training. The experience proves profoundly disorienting for librarians who have spent centuries relying on their psychic senses, suddenly finding themselves reduced to purely physical capabilities without the psychic awareness they have come to depend upon. The Necrons deploy pylons strategically to neutralize enemy Psykers, recognizing that many Imperial and Xenos forces rely heavily on psychic support, and that removing that support creates significant tactical advantages. The combat doctrine that librarians employ when facing enemy Psykers emphasizes establishing psychic superiority early in engagements, denying hostile Psykers the opportunity to employ their abilities effectively while maintaining freedom of action for friendly forces. A librarian detecting enemy Psykers during initial contact immediately begins psychic countermeasures, projecting interference that disrupts the hostile Psyker's concentration and makes channeling power more difficult. The techniques resemble jamming in conventional electronic warfare, the librarian generating psychic noise that obscures enemy Psykers' perception and forces them to expend additional effort to achieve results they could normally accomplish easily. The interference does not completely prevent enemy Psykers from functioning, but degrades their effectiveness enough to provide friendly forces with significant advantages. Direct psychic duels between opposing Psykers occur when interference proves insufficient to neutralize enemy psychic threats, the librarian engaging hostile Psykers in mental combat while physical battles rage around them. These duels involve each Psyker attempting to overwhelm the other's mental defenses through application of raw psychic force, to distract them sufficiently that they cannot maintain focus on supporting their forces, or to identify and exploit weaknesses in their psychic techniques. A librarian dueling a chaos sorcerer must balance offensive psychic assault with maintaining his own mental barriers against corruption, as the sorcerer will attempt to exploit any opening to plant seeds of doubt or to project corrupting influences. The return of Robute Guilliman to the Imperium in the closing years of the 41st millennium marked a fundamental shift in how the Adeptus Astartes organized and employed their psychic resources. The Primarch emerged from his stasis chamber on Macragge to find an Imperium vastly different from the one he had known, a realm beset by threats on every border, and split nearly in half by the Great Rift. Among the many changes that confronted Guilliman, the state of the various chapters' librarius organizations received his immediate attention. The Lord of Ultramar recognized that psychic warfare had become more critical than ever to the Imperium's survival, yet he also observed that many chapters maintained librarius structures that had ossified over millennia without adapting to evolving threats or incorporating new techniques that might improve effectiveness. The Indomitus crusade that Guilliman launched to stabilize the Imperium and push back the forces of chaos required unprecedented coordination between chapters that had operated independently for thousands of years. The Primarch established protocols for librarians from different chapters to share intelligence about psychic threats, to coordinate their efforts when multiple chapters deployed to the same war zones, and to pool their accumulated knowledge about combating the sorcerers and demons that had proliferated following the Great Rift's creation. These protocols met resistance from some chapters who viewed their librarius traditions as sacred and not subject to external interference, but Guilliman's authority as a returned Primarch and his practical arguments about operational necessity convinced most chapter masters to participate in the intelligence-sharing networks he established. The librarians serving in the Indomitus Crusade found themselves operating in environments where the barrier between real space and the warp had thinned dramatically compared to what previous generations had experienced. The Great Rift's presence created psychic disturbances that extended across entire sectors, making psychic channeling simultaneously more powerful and more dangerous than it had been before the galaxy split. A librarian attempting divination near the rift might perceive futures with unusual clarity, but also risk exposure to psychic phenomena that would have been impossible to encounter in more stable regions. The Crusade's librarians developed new techniques for operating in these hostile psychic environments, learning to recognize when the warp had become too turbulent for safe channeling and establishing protocols for mutual support when individual librarians found themselves overwhelmed by the psychic pressure. The introduction of Primaris Space Marines represented the most significant change to the Adeptus Astartes since their founding, and the Primaris librarians who emerged from Archmago's Belisarius Call's laboratories brought capabilities that exceeded what standard Space Marine Psykers could achieve. The enhancements that created Primaris Marines included modifications to the neurological structures that interface with psychic abilities, resulting in librarians whose connection to the warp proved stronger and more stable than their predecessors. A Primaris librarian could channel greater amounts of psychic energy without experiencing the same level of exhaustion that would incapacitate a standard librarian attempting equivalent feats. The additional gene seed organs that Primaris Marines possessed, particularly the sinew coils and the Magnificat, interacted with psychic channeling in ways that Call had designed specifically to enhance combat effectiveness when psychic and physical capabilities combined. The integration of Primaris librarians into existing chapter structures proceeded unevenly across the Imperium, with some chapters embracing the new warriors enthusiastically, while others maintained suspicion about these creations who had never undergone the traditional trials that defined their chapter's culture. The Ultramarines integrated Primaris librarians smoothly, as Guilliman's direct involvement in their deployment made resistance impossible, and the chapter's practical approach to warfare valued the enhanced capabilities regardless of their source. The Blood Angels accepted Primaris librarians after determining that the new gene seed still carried the genetic flaws inherited from Sanguinius, viewing this shared curse as proof that the Primaris warriors remained true sons of their Primarch despite their enhanced physiology. The Space Wolves proved more resistant, with some Wolf Lords questioning whether Primaris rune priests maintained proper connection to Fenris, given that they had been created in laboratories on Mars, rather than being recruited from the tribes of their homeworld. The equipment that Primaris librarians employed reflected Call's 10,000 years of research into improving Space Marine wargear. The psychic hoods worn by Primaris librarians incorporated technologies that standard chapters had lost access to millennia ago, providing enhanced protection against psychic attack and more efficient channeling of offensive abilities. The force weapons that Primaris librarians carried had been forged using techniques that combined the Mechanicus's understanding of psychically reactive materials with data recovered from the Great Crusade era, resulting in blades and staves that responded to their wielders' thoughts with precision that older force weapons could not match. Some traditional chapters viewed this advanced equipment with suspicion, maintaining that their own chapter-forged weapons carried spiritual significance that mass-produced gear from Call's manufactorums could never replicate. But the combat effectiveness of Primaris librarian equipment proved difficult to dispute. The tactical applications that Primaris librarians brought to the battlefield demonstrated capabilities that had been theoretical possibilities for standard librarians, but which few could achieve reliably. A Primaris librarian employing biomancy could enhance an entire squad's physical capabilities simultaneously, whereas a standard librarian typically focused such enhancements on himself or at most one or two battle brothers. The increased psychic reserves that Primaris librarians possessed allowed them to maintain defensive barriers for extended periods during sustained combat, providing protection that could mean the difference between a squad's survival or annihilation when facing enemies employing heavy weapons or psychic assault. The integration of Primaris-specific equipment, like the Bellicatus bolt rifles, with psychic abilities created new tactical options, as librarians could now engage targets at ranges where standard librarians would have been limited to supporting their squads rather than contributing direct fire. The psychic awakening that swept across the galaxy during the era of the Great Rift represented an unprecedented surge in psychic manifestations among human populations. Worlds that had previously produced Psykers at rates consistent with historical averages suddenly found themselves dealing with exponential increases in psychic births, with some planets reporting that 1 in every 100 children born demonstrated psychic sensitivity. The black ships that collected Psykers for processing through the Scholastica Psychona's facilities on Terra found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume of individuals requiring transport and evaluation. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica's infrastructure, designed to handle psychic manifestation rates that had remained relatively stable for millennia, struggled to adapt to the new reality where entire generations included psychic populations that previous eras would have considered impossible. The Space Marine chapters experienced this psychic awakening through increased rates of psychic manifestation among their aspirants and neophytes. Chapters that had historically maintained librarious organizations of perhaps a dozen warriors found themselves with twice that number of psychically gifted battle brothers, requiring training and integration into existing structures. The sudden influx created challenges that chief librarians had never faced, as training facilities designed for steady replacement of librarians lost to combat or age suddenly needed to accommodate cohorts of trainees that exceeded their capacity. Some chapters responded by expanding their librarious organizations beyond codex-recommended sizes, accepting that the changed psychic environment required more psychers to counter the increased threats. Others maintained traditional size limits, but became more selective in their recruitment, accepting only aspirants who demonstrated exceptional psychic potential rather than training every neophyte who manifested abilities. The increased warp storm activity that accompanied the Great Rift's creation made librarians more essential to chapter operations than at any point since the Horus Heresy. Regions of space that had been reliably accessible through warp travel for thousands of years became impassable as storms erupted without warning, trapping fleets in the Immaterium for subjective months or years, while only days passed in real space. Navigators struggled to find safe routes through the turbulent warp, and astropaths reported that psychic communication had become unreliable across vast swathes of the Imperium. Librarians found themselves pressed into service supporting their chapter's fleet operations, using their abilities to reinforce navigator guidance during warp transits or to establish psychic beacons that could guide separated elements of a fleet back to their primary force when conventional communication failed. The combat against Chaos forces intensified dramatically following the Great Rift's opening, as demon incursions that had previously required elaborate rituals and specific conditions to manifest now occurred with disturbing frequency. Librarians deployed to war zones throughout the Imperium found themselves facing greater demons and sorcerers wielding powers that would have been considered exceptional threats before the Rift, but which had become almost commonplace in the new era. A single campaign might see a Librarius facing multiple demon princes, coordinated assaults by Thousand Sons sorcerer cabals, and reality breaches that allowed lesser demons to pour through in numbers that overwhelmed conventional defenses. The constant exposure to chaos corruption and the psychic pressure generated by operating near the Great Rift took severe tolls on Librarians' mental defenses, with some succumbing to corruption despite training and safeguards that should have protected them. The defensive responsibilities that Librarians assumed extended beyond battlefield support to include maintaining psychic wards around their chapters' fortress monasteries and fleet assets. The increased warp activity made demonic assault on chapter facilities a genuine possibility rather than the theoretical threat it had represented in more stable eras. Chief Librarians coordinated efforts to strengthen existing hexagrammic wards, to establish new protective barriers around critical locations, and to maintain constant psychic vigilance for signs of demonic incursion attempts. The work consumed enormous amounts of time and psychic energy that might otherwise have been devoted to training or research, but the alternative, leaving chapter facilities vulnerable to demonic attack, was unacceptable given the proven reality that demons now actively sought opportunities to strike at Space Marine strongholds. The intelligence-gathering role that Librarians had always performed became exponentially more important as conventional sources of information became unreliable or unavailable. Astropathic communication that had once provided reasonably timely updates about conditions across the Imperium now arrived months or years late if it arrived at all, and large regions existed in complete communication blackout where no messages penetrated the warp storms, isolating them. Librarians using divination to predict enemy movements or to identify threats before they fully manifested provided the only advance warning that many chapters received about impending attacks. The predictions remained imperfect and subject to the inherent uncertainties of divination, but even probabilistic information about future threats proved more valuable than the complete ignorance that would otherwise prevail. The cooperation between Librarians and other imperial psychic institutions improved somewhat during this period, driven by necessity rather than any fundamental resolution of the jurisdictional tensions that had existed for millennia. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica found itself desperately short of trained Psykers capable of combating the chaos forces spreading across the Imperium, and the organization began reaching out to Space Marine chapters, requesting temporary assignment of Librarians to support operations that would normally fall outside chapter responsibilities. Some chapters agreed to these requests, viewing them as opportunities to gain intelligence about threats affecting the broader Imperium, while demonstrating the Adeptus Astartes' commitment to humanity's defense. Others refused, maintaining that their Librarians served their chapter exclusively, and that diverting them to support other imperial institutions would compromise their primary mission. The Inquisition's relationship with Space Marine Librarians evolved as the Ordo Malleus and Ordo Hereticus found themselves overwhelmed by the volume of demonic incursions and heretical uprisings requiring investigation. Inquisitors who had previously maintained arm's-length relationships with Space Marine chapters began actively seeking their cooperation, recognizing that Librarians possessed capabilities and knowledge that could prove decisive in combating threats that the Inquisition's own resources struggled to address. Some chapters viewed these overtures with suspicion, remembering historical instances where inquisitorial involvement in chapter affairs had led to conflict or unwanted scrutiny. Others saw opportunities to influence inquisitorial policy or to gain access to information that the Inquisition had gathered about chaos activities across the Imperium. The Grey Knights maintained their status as the Imperium's premier demon-hunting force, but even these specialized warriors found themselves stretched thin by the sheer number of demonic incursions requiring response. The Grey Knights began coordinating more closely with other chapters' librarians, sharing techniques for combating specific demon types and providing intelligence about chaos cult activities that might threaten Space Marine recruiting worlds or operational areas. The cooperation remained limited by the Grey Knights' obsessive secrecy and their willingness to execute potential witnesses to demonic incursions, including Space Marines from other chapters, who the Grey Knights deemed to have been compromised by exposure to chaos. These executions created tensions that prevented the full integration that operational efficiency might otherwise suggest, with most chapters maintaining careful distance from the Grey Knights even while acknowledging their effectiveness against demonic threats. The future challenges facing librarians in the 41st millennium and beyond appear more daunting than at any point since the Horus Heresy. The Great Rift shows no signs of closing, and the Psychic Awakening continues to produce new Psykers at rates that strain the Imperium's capacity to train and control them. The chapters must adapt their librarious organizations to operate indefinitely in environments where the warp's influence pervades real space to degrees that previous generations would have considered impossible. The traditional safeguards and training protocols that protected librarians from corruption were designed for conditions where the barrier between dimensions remained relatively stable, and their effectiveness in the current environment remains uncertain. Some chief librarians have begun developing new techniques specifically designed for operating near the Great Rift, accepting that the old methods prove insufficient for the changed reality. The Cicatrix Maledictum's influence on psychic phenomena extends beyond simply making the warp more turbulent or dangerous to access. The Great Rift has created regions where the normal rules governing psychic practice no longer apply consistently, where techniques that should work reliably instead produce unpredictable results or fail entirely. Librarians operating in these areas report experiencing psychic phenomena that their training never prepared them for, visions that show multiple contradictory futures simultaneously, psychic signatures that appear to exist in several locations at once, or encounters with entities that seem to be demons, but which do not conform to any known classification. The librarious organizations across the Imperium are attempting to catalog these new phenomena and develop appropriate responses, but the work proceeds slowly given the dangers involved in studying manifestations that might themselves represent chaos corruption. The question of humanity's psychic evolution looms over all discussions about the librarius's future role. The Imperium has always maintained populations of Psykers who required control and direction to prevent them from becoming threats, but the current psychic awakening suggests that humanity might be undergoing a fundamental transformation in its relationship with the warp. Some theorists within the Librarius argue that humanity is evolving toward becoming a psychic species comparable to the Eldar, with psychic ability becoming the norm rather than the exception across future generations. Others maintain that the increased psychic manifestations represent temporary disruption caused by the Great Rift rather than permanent evolutionary change, and that psychic birth rates will return to historical norms once the warp stabilizes. The implications of either possibility for the Adeptus Astartes prove profound. If humanity is genuinely evolving into a psychic species, the chapters may need to fundamentally reimagine what it means to be a Space Marine, with psychic ability becoming an expected capability for all battle brothers rather than the specialized domain of the Librarius. The gene seed implantation process might require modification to account for aspirants who all possess at least latent psychic potential, and the training regimens that create Space Marines would need to incorporate psychic instruction as a standard component rather than specialized education reserved for a select few. The organizational structures that currently segregate librarians into separate departments might become obsolete if every warrior possesses psychic capabilities requiring development and oversight. The alternative, that current conditions represent temporary disruption rather than permanent change, offers little comfort, as even temporary disruption lasting centuries or millennia would require adaptations that might prove difficult to reverse once the crisis passes. Chapters that expand their librarious organizations to handle increased psychic manifestations among their recruits will face difficult decisions about whether to maintain those larger organizations if psychic birth rates eventually decline to historical levels. The techniques and protocols being developed for operating in the current hostile psychic environment might become so ingrained in chapter culture that future generations struggle to return to older methods even when conditions theoretically allow for it. The librarians serving the Imperium in the 41st millennium face an uncertain future, where the only certainty is that their role will continue evolving in response to threats that previous generations never imagined. They stand as humanity's primary defense against psychic threats that have proliferated beyond anything the Great Crusade encountered, wielding powers that mark them as both essential assets and potential dangers requiring constant vigilance. The balance between utilizing their capabilities and maintaining safeguards against corruption grows more precarious with each passing year as the warp's influence on real space intensifies. Yet the Librarius endures, adapting to changed conditions while maintaining the core principles that have guided Space Marine Psykers since before the heresy: discipline, loyalty to their chapters and the Emperor, and absolute commitment to humanity's defense regardless of the personal cost. The galaxy burns, the warp rages, and the Librarians continue their eternal vigil against the darkness, knowing that their vigilance represents one of the few barriers preventing humanity's complete extinction in an age of unprecedented peril.